This is not a love story. I'm speaking mostly to the people who don't actually know it already, which I'm assuming is largely my male audience, but I don't care what you've been told or what you've assumed from walking past the TV as your mother, sister, girlfriend, what have you, was watching a film version. I don't care if everything you've heard about Pride and Prejudice has you believing it's just a period piece drama about mushy things like feelings and love. This is a war story, full of plans of attack, espionage, double crosses, collateral damage. Sure, it may be psychological warfare instead of the type that involves guns, but that does not make it any less gripping of a tale. They say all is fair in love and war. This story would suggest that is because love is war, especially when the number of eligible bachelors is far fewer than the number of single women looking for an advantageous marriage. So buckle up, because you are not prepared for how conniving, how backstabbing, how action-packed the story is, despite the visuals you have seen always just showing women in large dresses and men in layered suits riding around in carriages. I'm Jameson Olsen, this is Becoming the Main Character, and today you're joining me for the book that in a BBC poll once ranked number 2 all time behind Lord of the Rings as the greatest English novel ever to be written. This is Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now, this is one of the most famous opening lines in literary history. You can't find a video on YouTube that talks about Pride and Prejudice without them quoting that line. And to a less attuned reader, they would take it at face value because it was common sense for the Regency era of England. Don't worry, we'll explain what Regency era was soon. But this statement may not trigger you as anything other than a statement of fact about the intentions and motivations of people of the time, unless you knew who you were dealing with. Unless you knew that this was the notorious Jane Austen, the woman whose pen might as well have been her microphone for a new Netflix comedy special, because she was as sharp with her wit as a sculptor was with their chisel. This was a time where you could get in trouble for openly criticizing the government or the aristocracy, so many authors wrote of historical periods, foreign lands, or other plot lines that could not be possibly used to show that they were making a critical eye of the world they lived in. But Jane Austen was not about to be silenced. She had some strong, critical opinions of different moral issues of her time that she addressed indirectly in her stories, including slavery and poverty, but in this book, we are much more focused on her takes of class-based society, the way money made people act, and the ridiculous ideas around marriage, both its purpose and the way it was handled. So, to her, this line was not just setting the stage for this being a story about wealthy men looking for wives. She was throwing the first punch, letting us know that she is about to rock our worlds with the amount of satire she will be sending our way. Imagining that line with a sarcastic tone changes the entire understanding of that sentence. But moving away from the intro, we are told that because of this fact, when a wealthy bachelor moves into a new neighborhood, it doesn't matter if that idea of him being in search of a wife is actually high on his list of priorities, because it is the number 1 priority of all the families in the area with available daughters. So our first line of dialogue, appropriately, is from a mother of 5 single daughters ranging from about 16 to 22. "My dear Mr. Bennet," she said, "did you hear that Netherfield Park, a country estate in the area, has been rented at last?" Her husband didn't even look up from his book, as he said he had not. Mrs. Bennet, or Mrs. B as I will refer to her many times, seems annoyed that he isn't more interested in who it is. "Don't you want to know who has taken it?" she said with a little bit of exasperation. "I can see that you want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." He learns from his wife, who heard it from a neighbor, that it is a single man from the north of London by the name of Bingley, a man worth 4,000 to 5,000 a year. She was beaming as she said this. "What a fine thing for our girls." Mr. Bennet, as you will quickly see, seems to take pride in annoying his wife by playing ignorant. So he asked her, "How can this affect them?" "How can you be so tiresome?" she shot back at him, visibly agitated. "You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them." "Is that the reason he came here?" Mr. Bennet asked teasingly. "Reason?" Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, getting more and more worked up. She claims that it is obviously not his reason, but if he should fall in love while here, what a wonderful thing that would be. She then tells her husband that he must go introduce himself to this Mr. Bingley as soon as possible so they can arrange for a dinner or some form of a visit. He tells her that he doesn't have any reason to visit the man, but that she should take the girls over herself. And then, after a pause, to make his wife feel better about herself, he said, "Maybe you should just send the girls. If you go, he's just as likely to choose you as any of them." She blushed, saying that when a woman has 5 grown daughters, she should stop worrying about looking beautiful herself. But the flattery, likely used as a diversion to get her off the topic of making him visit their new neighbor, did not last long. She begs him to think of his daughters and how all of the other families in the area will be acting quickly so that if he doesn't do something, Mr. Bingley will likely marry somebody else's daughter. He returns back to the idea of his wife just taking the girls herself, saying that he'll happily include a note to the gentleman explaining that he is agreeable to this Mr. Bingley marrying any of his daughters, although he may make a special plug for Lizzie. Mrs. B scoffed. "Lizzie is no better than the others. Jane is prettier, Lydia is much more pleasing company, yet you always give Lizzie your preference." Mr. B mutters something about how all the daughters have some level of silliness about them, except for Lizzie. She is sharper than the rest. "Mr. Bennet," his wife swatted him on the shoulder in disapproval, saying he must not abuse his own children like this, adding a question about why he delights in vexing her so much, saying that he has no compassion for her nerves. Mr. Bennet dryly replies that she is mistaken, that he has high respect for her nerves. They have been his old friends as he's listened to her talk about them for over 20 years. "You do not know what I suffer," his wife said as she exited the room in a huff. The narrator then points out something about the father figure of the Bennet household. Quote, "Mr. Bennet was an odd mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character." Mrs. Bennet, on the other hand, is described as a woman who doesn't understand much and has a quick temper, and how she confused her own discontentment with anything as nervousness, meaning that whenever she wasn't happy with a situation, she would fall back on claiming that other people were triggering her anxiety. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Other than that, the only thing she bothered to busy herself with were visiting other families and learning any news by means of gossip. A few days went by and the family was gathered in a room, everyone employed by a different task. Elizabeth Bennet, the second oldest of the 5 daughters, often referred to as Lizzie and sometimes Eliza, was trimming a hat. Mr. Bennet, with a very smug smile on his face, knew that what he was about to say would kick off an interaction that would completely disrupt this peaceful moment, and he did so with a smile. Referring to the hat that Lizzie was working on, he said, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it." Mrs. Bennet didn't miss a beat, saying that they'll never know, since they'll never get a chance to meet him. Lizzie says that they will eventually, whether it's at church or through the introduction of Mrs. Long, who had promised to make their acquaintance at some point. Mrs. Bennet scoffs. She doesn't believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing because she has 2 daughters of her own and is a selfish, hypocritical woman and, quote, "I have no opinion of her." Get used to this type of ironic, completely lacking self-awareness statement from Mrs. B. It's kind of her trademark to say something like, "She is selfish and hypocritical, but I don't have any thoughts on her as a person," is very par for the course with her. Mr. Bennet, reeling her in, still not quite ready to ignite the fuse, states that he is glad to see his wife does not depend on that woman for any favors. This statement was enough to send his wife into critiquing their second youngest daughter, Kitty, which is a nickname for Catherine, about the coughing that she was up to, claiming that her daughter's coughing was lacking compassion for her mother's nerves. See, again, because she's not happy, she's externalizing her discontent into other people for not being sensitive to her feelings. This type of character drives me up a wall in real life, but Jane Austen does such a good job of making her bizarrely entertaining that I can put up with her in the context of this book. The women start talking about what the next ball will be like, which is a great chance to try and meet this Mr. Bingley. They reason that it's just over 2 weeks from now, and since Mrs. Long doesn't get back into town until the day before, it probably won't be until then that they can meet this Mr. Bingley. But, almost ready to drop the bomb, Mr. B, while trying to seem uninterested, said that in that case, maybe Mrs. Bennet will have the advantage of introducing Mrs. Long to Bingley herself. "I'm sick of hearing of Bingley," Mrs. B said. "I'm sorry to hear that. I wish you'd told me that before I went over there this morning, or I would have saved myself the trouble. And now that I've paid him a visit, we cannot escape his acquaintance." There it was. The fuse had been lit, the hook had been set, and Mr. Bennet got the exact satisfaction he had hoped for from all 6 of the Bennet women as they slowly pieced together what he'd just said about having already paid Bingley a visit, which would definitely set them up to be introduced as a family. Mrs. Bennet's initial joy quickly turned to her claiming that she knew all along that he would eventually do as she wished. She immediately began to ramble about the opportunity they would have to make an impression on him, and her husband, knowing his fun was over, left the room. "What an excellent father you have, girls," Mrs. Bennet said cheerfully, and the 6 of them began to speculate how quickly Mr. Bingley might return their father's visit, and how they would then invite him over for dinner. Mr. Bennet likely knew he would be bombarded with questions about Bingley since he'd seen him with his own eyes, but he was pretty good at being of so little help that his wife ended up going around to their other neighbor and friend, Lady Lucas, who had gotten a much better report from her husband, Sir William. They learn he is young, handsome, very agreeable, and that he intends to be at the upcoming ball with a large group of his own friends. Everyone knew that a ball was one of the best places to fall in love, while dancing, so everyone looked forward to seeing him there. Mrs. Bennet immediately sent a dinner invitation over and had already been planning an elaborate meal, so she was heartbroken when the invitation returned with Mr. Bingley's regrets that he would have to go to London that day. She began to panic that her designs of having her daughters get a lot of FaceTime with the gentleman may be hindered if he was going to be jumping back and forth between Hertfordshire in order to go to town quite often. The emotions of the Bennet women roller coastered. First up when they learned that he'd gone to London to bring back his large party for the upcoming ball, then down when the rumor was that there would be 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him. That was too many young ladies. But then back up again when they learned it was only 6 women and all of them were his relations. And when the night of the ball actually came, there were only 2 of his sisters with him and 2 men. One his brother-in-law, the other a dark, brooding young gentleman who seemed to rather be anywhere else than here. Now, something I came across in my research that I hadn't realized on my own is that Austen rarely gets very descriptive about her characters' appearances. Whereas a lot of authors, the first paragraph or 2 about somebody is describing the shape of their nose, the color of their hair, how they fidget, etc., etc. Austen didn't ever get too descriptive with this kind of thing. Bingley is described as good-looking and gentlemanlike, with a pleasing countenance and easy and effortless ability to be social. Mr. and Mrs. Hurst were the names of his one sister and her husband, but it was his friend, Mr. Darcy, who soon drew the attention of the entire room with his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and quote the report which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance of his having 10,000 a year. He is noted as being more handsome than Bingley even, much more handsome in fact. Many people couldn't take their eyes off him the entire evening, but his behavior slowly made people lose interest in him, because he refused to speak to anyone outside of his party if he could help it. He looked uptight whenever he was forced to introduce himself to someone, and so it was quickly discovered that he was a very proud man, and he felt he was above his current company. Within just a couple hours, Mr. Bingley had met everyone in the room and danced many songs. He was carefree and laughed easily. By contrast, Mr. Darcy had only danced with Mrs. Hurst and with Miss Bingley, and had spent the rest of his night in silence or talking to Mr. Hurst or his friend, Charles Bingley. His character had been decided. He must be the most proud, most disagreeable man in the world, and everyone in the room hoped that he would never come there again. Quote, amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet, whose dislike of his general behavior was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. And now we got to back up to hear what she's talking about. Because there were far fewer gentlemen than women at this ball, and Elizabeth Bennet found herself sitting down for a couple dances. And from where she was sitting, she could overhear Mr. Bingley walk up to Darcy and chastise him for not being more social. Come, Darcy, Bingley said, I must have you dance. I don't like seeing you standing here in this stupid manner. She heard the unamused tone of Darcy's reply. I will not. You know how much I detest it, unless I know my dance partner very well. Your sisters are busy with other partners, and there is not another woman in this room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand with. Bingley rolled his eyes at such a statement. You're ridiculous, he said. I have never seen so many pleasant young women in one room as I do here tonight. Several of them are uncommonly pretty. You, Darcy said with emphasis, are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room, he said, looking over at Elizabeth's older sister, Jane. Bingley was already smiling as he looked over at Jane. "Yes, she is the most beautiful creature I ever saw." "But," Bingley said, not realizing that Lizzie could hear them, "one of her sisters is very pretty and I think very agreeable. How about I ask her sister to introduce you to?" Darcy seemed to think it over for just a second. "She is tolerable," he said, "but not handsome enough to tempt me." He then said something that basically means he's not interested in chasing anyone who is not the most valuable prize in the room, meaning Jane, I guess. And then he told his friend to go back to his dancing partner because Bingley's stupidly large grin was being wasted on him. Later, Lizzie snuck off to her friends to tell them that story, and they all were brimming with hatred for the man. In a way, that interaction made them feel good about not liking him. The Bennet ladies had all come to the ball without their father, but when they got home, all of them feeling like they'd had the best night ever, he was still up reading in his study. Quote, "With a book, he was regardless of time." Mrs. Bennet was quick to corner her husband and started telling the entire story of the night. The highlight was Mr. Bingley having asked Jane to dance twice. We'll talk about why that's a big deal later. But she proceeded to explain every detail of every dance Mr. Bingley had had with every young woman from other families until he couldn't take it any longer, and he said, "If he had any compassion for me, he would not have danced half so much. I wish he'd sprained his ankle in the first dance." Just as she finished her praise of Bingley, she began to talk of her distaste for Darcy, including the story that Elizabeth had shared. But she says that Lizzie is not missing out on anything because he is the most disagreeable, horrid man, and he is not worth pleasing. Mr. Bennet sighed. One way or another, he was going to have to listen to his wife's entire retelling of the night he had so purposefully tried to avoid. Jane, who is the most sensible and unassuming of the 5 Bennet daughters, had been pretty tight-lipped of her opinions of Mr. Bingley until she was up in her room alone with her next youngest sister, Lizzie, her only confidant. "He is just what a young man ought to be," she said. "Sensible, good-humored, lively, and I've never seen such good manners. Doesn't hurt that he's handsome," Lizzie said with a half-smile. "I was very flattered he asked me to dance a second time. I didn't expect such a compliment." Lizzie laughed. "You are always surprised by compliments. Why shouldn't he ask you for a second dance? You were 5 times prettier than anyone else." "But," the younger of the two said, "I give you permission to like him. You've liked many a stupider man in the past." Jane acts shocked at the claim, but Lizzie tells her she is too trusting and forgiving, that she sees the good in people who have none to find. And then Jane goes on to explain a lot of details about the Bingley family that she had learned from Mr. Bingley that night. Lizzie didn't really care about what was being said, but she just smiled to see Jane so excited about someone that Lizzie could at least approve of as a potentially good match for her sister. Lizzie only really started paying attention when she heard the name Darcy brought up. And so we learn more about the two men. We discover that Bingley and Darcy were one of those pairings that were largely such good friends because of how opposite they were. Bingley was easygoing, open, and flexible in nature. Darcy was rigid, more analytical, and sharper. Not to say Bingley was dumb, but Darcy was just that much more intelligent. Darcy was very proud and extremely picky. He had been raised well enough that his manners were technically perfect, but he had no warmth to him in his display of being so well-mannered. So being likable is where Bingley had Darcy beat by a mile. Darcy somehow could offend people without even trying. And as we look back at the exchange that Lizzie had overheard at the ball, this all matches up perfectly with those descriptions. She felt satisfied in her dislike of this Mr. Darcy. The next morning, Mrs. Lucas came over to recap how the ball had gone. Lady Lucas is described to us as being a good, kind woman, but not too clever that she could not be valuable as a neighbor to Mrs. Bennet. We don't get any elaboration of what that means, so you interpret it as you will. She had several children herself, the oldest being Charlotte, an intelligent woman of 27, and despite a moderate age difference, we're talking about like 7 years, she and Lizzie were best friends. Charlotte had been brought over with her mom, and Mrs. Bennet smiled as she acknowledged that the 27-year-old had been Mr. Bingley's first choice for a dancing partner. She probably only said that because she knew Mrs. Lucas would be obliged to reply how Jane had been the only one who'd been asked to dance with him twice, however. Mrs. Bennet smiled a proud little smirk, knowing that that was more impressive of an achievement. The neighbor then looked sympathetically at Lizzie, saying she'd heard what Mr. Darcy had said about her. Mrs. Bennet reacted sharply, saying don't put the idea into her daughter's head that it's a bad thing to be disliked by such an unlikable man. She then proceeded to spit out several rumors of his poor behavior that night to further the idea that you would be crazy to want to be liked by him. Mrs. Lucas said all that may be, but she still wishes he'd had the courtesy to dance with Lizzie. This was followed by a rebuke from her mom, saying she doesn't advise Lizzie to ever dance with that man. And Lizzie just smiled and said she can safely promise that she doesn't have any desire to dance with him. Mrs. Lucas, who seemed fixated on Darcy, commented that she knows it's not an excuse, but she can almost accept that such a man would be prideful. With all his fine upbringing and lineage, it's almost to be expected. That's true, Lizzie said, and I could almost forgive his pride if it had not wounded my own. Mary, the middle of the Bennet daughters, also the most bookish and least social, piped up for the first time, saying, "Pride is a very common failing, I believe," but then points out, "Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us." It wasn't long before the Bennet ladies paid a visit to Netherfield, the estate that Bingley was renting, to visit his sisters. In short, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, the two sisters, quickly learned to like Jane because of how nice she was, but they found the mother intolerable and the younger sisters not worth getting to know. But in order to get to know Jane better, they would put up with the whole group for small periods of time. It didn't take long for Lizzie to suspect that the only reason either of the Bingley women were interested in her sister was because it was already becoming more obvious that their brother was interested in her. At one point, she was talking to her friend Charlotte Lucas about how her biggest concern for Jane was that the eldest Bennet daughter had such a cheerful disposition to everyone and had such a fear of being seen as impertinent that she was the exact same level of friendly to a man she was interested in as she was to someone that she felt nothing for. And then Charlotte says something very sharp about how if a woman is too careful about concealing her affections for a man, she may lose her chance of fixing him or, making something happen with him. Because there are very few people who can go on loving someone if they do not get encouragement in return. And that in 9 out of 10 cases, a woman needs to show more affection than she feels if she can hope for the man she likes to take notice of it. Lizzie agrees to this, and she says that Jane does try to help Mr. Bingley on, at least as much as Jane's personality can allow, but she does not think it's enough. Charlotte points out that it will take a lot of FaceTime for Bingley to be able to pick up on hints if they're only dropped rarely on the times that they are together. And they talk more about how Jane is more the type to want to take things slow because she wants to be sure that it's a good man. But Charlotte says if Jane were to marry Bingley tomorrow, she doubts that she would find herself any less happy than if she spent a whole year studying his character first. Charlotte goes on to say that being happy in marriage is basically luck. Because even if two people seem perfectly matched or think they know each other really well beforehand, that doesn't guarantee anything because people always end up changing enough to irritate each other anyway. So you might as well know as little as possible about the flaws of the person you're going to spend your life with. Lizzie just laughs at Charlotte and says there's no way she actually believes that. But then the narrator transitions away from this private conversation, saying that Lizzie was so occupied watching Mr. Bingley and his intentions to her sister that she had no idea or suspicion that she was herself becoming an object of interest in the eyes of his friend, Mr. Darcy. The man who at first had been resentful to even describe her as pretty was now feeling things. The first time he saw her, he only looked on her to find reasons to criticize. But it was almost as if the very moment he told his friend she wasn't that attractive, he couldn't help but find himself lost in her eyes, which are described as dark with beautiful expression. He was horrified that this discovery was followed by others that made him feel things for her. Her figure was pleasing, and even though she wasn't as perfectly mannered as, say, Miss Bingley, there was an easy playfulness to Elizabeth that he was drawn to. But to all of this, Lizzie was clueless. And so he started looking for ways to be in her presence again, hoping to find ways to be close to his muse. And it was soon after that there was a party at Sir William Lucas's house, which is Charlotte's dad, just to make sure you're keeping up with all these names. And Lizzie noticed his behavior because he had seemed to be standing so close to her conversation with Colonel Forster that she assumed he had to have been eavesdropping, and she told as much to Charlotte. And it was only moments after that Darcy actually approached them. Lizzie's fiery, independent nature led her to playfully calling him out on it by asking if he didn't think that she had expressed herself very well when she teased Colonel Forster about needing to host a ball at Meryton. "With great energy," he said politely, "but it is a subject that always makes a lady energetic." They then stood in silence for a bit as they listened to Lizzie's sister Mary play a concerto on the piano. And poor Mary, she doesn't have an abrasive personality or much of a personality at all, but she definitely catches a lot of strays from Austen's pen, because we are told that Mary, being the plainest of the five sisters, had worked hard for her knowledge and accomplishments, and that made her eager to display them since she wasn't really ever approached for her looks or social wit. But that without having natural talent, even her dedication to her practice made her play kind of stiffly, adding on that even though Lizzie wasn't half as good as her younger sister technically, people generally preferred to listen to Lizzie play. And like I said, that's all just an aside from the narrator taking shots at Mary. But while they were all listening to Mary play, the host, Sir Lucas, came up to Darcy and said that there's nothing like dancing, that he considers it one of the first refinements of polished society. Darcy says it is also popular among less polished societies, quote, "Every savage can dance." He then states that he avoids dancing whenever he can help it. But Sir Lucas, whether by ignorance or maybe feeling cheeky as the party's host, he sees Elizabeth and scolds her for not being out there on the dance floor, and he grabs Lizzie's hand and extends it to Darcy, making it clear he wanted the two of them to go dance. Darcy was surprised, but he didn't turn down the offer as he slowly lifted his hand to take Elizabeth's. But he was too slow, and Lizzie had already yanked her hand back out of Sir Lucas's as she said she'd thank the gentleman to not assume that she'd come in this direction looking for a partner. Darcy offered to dance himself, feeling like that was the gentlemanly thing to do in this situation in order to preserve the idea that Lizzie was desirable as a partner. But Lizzie was determined not to be forced into anything she didn't want to do. Sir Lucas was not done trying to play matchmaker, however, and he said he knows that Mr. Darcy isn't a huge fan of dancing, but he's sure he'd be of a mind to dance with the beautiful Elizabeth. And it was at this moment that Darcy and Lizzie locked eyes as the host kept talking. There was an uneasiness in both of their gazes. Darcy's eyes pierced, Lizzie's sparkled. They had missed whatever Sir Lucas had been saying, but he finished the argument with the sentence, quote, "For who would object to such a partner?" Lizzie snapped out of the moment and turned away to avoid whatever she had just felt in that moment. But Darcy wasn't offended. He showed just the faintest hint of a smile as he watched her walk away. But his thoughts were disrupted when Bingley's sister came up and started talking about how much he was right to detest parties like this, how annoying they were, so noisy, the self-importance of these people. Darcy, who did not realize Miss Bingley was trying her best to be an early 19th century pick-me girl, confided in her that he was actually having a great time, that he had just been meditating on what a great pleasure it is to look into the eyes of a pretty woman. "Who are you talking about?" Miss Bingley demanded to know. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet," he said, still in a trance. Miss Bingley did her best to not go slack-jawed at that statement. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet," she said, like she had just gotten a bad taste in her mouth. She immediately and instinctively used one of the tools that is most effective at trying to change someone's mind on a topic like this. She teased him. "When is the wedding day?" she asked with just the right amount of snark. "I knew you'd say that," Darcy said, undeterred. "A lady's imagination is very fast. It jumps from admiration to love, from love to marriage, all in a moment." Desperate to find something that would make him think twice of his newfound affection, Miss Bingley jokes that he'll have a charming mother-in-law, who she assumes will be at Pemberley, which is the name of his estate, all the time. She keeps trying to poke holes in his feelings with more jokes, but he just stared off, reflecting on the electricity of that moment when their eyes had been fixed on each other. What was this feeling he was having? Okay, we're going to take a break here to fill you in on some details, as well as explain some things that are about to come up. I'm going to call this a primer on the age of Regency England. Now, the actual years of the Regency era are not always agreed on, but basically just think of it as the first 20 years of the 1800s. It was called the Regency era because King George had gone mentally ill and his son, the prince, was named the Prince Regent until he actually became the king around year 1820. And in the Jekyll and Hyde episode, we talked about how stuffy and unbearably scrutinizing the Victorian era was. Well, the Regency era was a predecessor to the Victorian. And in England at this time, status was everything. But it was also improper to spend time alone with the opposite sex. Things like balls or group social visits were the primary way of getting to know people. But those situations weren't very private, which contributed to why everything became so coded in psychological warfare. because the best way for a woman to survive was to marry well, which is why men were described by things like their annual income. You've already heard us describe Bingley as being worth $5,000 a year and Darcy worth at least $10,000. So we need to stop acting like gold digging is a recent invention. But back then, when it was improper for a woman to do so many things, like run a business, for example, there should be a little more grace for such a practice. They were very much discouraged from doing anything that could provide for their own survival. Instead, they were encouraged, as we'll see discussed in a chapter very soon, to develop skills like singing, playing instruments, learning languages, art, etc. They were basically encouraged to become trophy wives, showing off how accomplished they were in order to attract wealthier partners. There are a lot of other very specific oddities of the Regency era that we'll get into as they pop up in the story, but hopefully this helps paint the picture for why people like Mrs. Bennet act the way they do. And don't forget, Pride and Prejudice is in many ways poking fun at the realities of this time in England. But in order to get the ironies, it was important for you to understand the status quo. And speaking of additional oddities of the time, in the next chapter, we learn that Mr. Bingley, who is technically a gentleman, which I think it's important to note what a gentleman actually was, since today we just use it to describe a kind man who treats others well. But back then there was a more literal meaning to it. And if I were to boil it down to the most simple definition I can, a gentleman was someone who owned enough assets like land, homes, farms, etc., that he did not have to work for a living. He made it off rentals or investments. He was gentle because he spent his time reading, riding horses, participating in sports, and, of course, socializing. So, with that definition, Mr. Bennet is as much a gentleman as Bingley or Darcy. None of them have to work for a living, but we learn that Mr. Bennet's estate brings in £2,000 a year, which is barely enough to keep the estate functioning after you pay for all the labor and taxes, etc. Whereas Bingley and Darcy are worth tens of thousands and actually come across as rich, if we want to put it that way. We also learn that due to the financial hardship, the estate is entailed, which means when he dies, none of his daughters will inherit it, but it will actually go to their closest male relative, a cousin in this case. Now, entailments aren't required by law just because you don't have a male inheritor, so I found myself asking, why would you choose to entail your estate and leave your daughters scrambling to find good husbands because they won't get anything from you? And the answer I found, obviously more feminist sensibilities still won't like it, but it basically comes down to wanting to keep the estate intact, keeping it in the family, essentially. And because of the marital system, his choices were to basically sell the estate and split the proceedings between his 5 kids, or pass it on to a male who could keep it together. So unfortunately for the 5 Bennet sisters, when their father died, this cousin, who we will meet very shortly, will take over and could, in theory, make all of them homeless. So even though I think she acts completely insane, we can sympathize with the pressure Mrs. Bennet feels to get her daughters all in good situations while their father is alive. Mrs. Bennet did not come from a gentle family. They were good people, and one of her sisters had married a lawyer. Her other brother, we never learned what he did. We just know it was a respectable trade. So it's not like they were peasants, but they were very much middle class. And now that we've laid that out, let's summarize the rest of this chapter pretty quickly. We learn that a military regiment has come to Meryton and will be stationed there for the entire winter. Lydia and Kitty, who are the youngest sisters, are delighted to have men in uniform hang out for so long. The way that they talk about the soldiers makes Mr. Bennet worry that they are just silly girls. His wife chastises him again for being so critical of his own kids. And at breakfast, a note comes for Jane from Miss Bingley, inviting her to Netherfield to spend the day. And this is where we get to see the genius of the mind of 5-star General Mrs. Bennet in terms of psychological warfare, because she notes that it looks like rain and tells Jane she cannot have the carriage, but she must take a horse. So that way, when it rains, Jane will have to spend the night. "Tell them your father needed the carriage," she said. What did I tell you? This is warfare, and as silly as she may be, Mrs. Bennet understands the rules of engagement. Jane is shocked that her mother would suggest something so purposefully deceitful, but her mom gets her way, and after Jane had left and it started to rain, Mrs. Bennet remarks on how lucky this idea of hers was. Jane will be cooped up in the same house as Mr. Bingley all night. The next morning, however, Lizzie got a note from Jane saying she was sick from riding in the rain for so long and would not be able to come home for some time. Mr. Bennet, with his classic dry wit, told his wife that if your daughter dies from this illness, it will at least be a comfort to know it was all in the pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under her orders. His wife shrugged him off and said this was even better because There was no chance that the illness would be life-threatening, but at least this meant she would be in the care of Mr. Bingley for several more days. This is perfect, she thought. Lizzie wanted to go attend to her sister desperately, but the carriage wasn't available, and Lizzie had never been one to ride horses, so she decides that she will walk. It's only about 3 miles to Netherfield, and Lizzie likes the exercise. Her younger sisters go with her for the first mile until they get to the village where the younger siblings are all just going to go spot soldiers. The rest of the way was muddy because of the large amounts of rain they'd had in the last 24 hours. The roads were very messy, so Lizzie was hopping over puddles and crossing fields to make good time. But when she showed up at Netherfield, she was a sight. Her socks and dress hem were covered in mud, and her face was red from the exertion. She was let into the parlor where Miss Bingley and her sister Mrs. Hurst, Mr. Hurst, Bingley, and Darcy were all seated. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley looked at Lizzie like she was an alien to have chosen to walk through the mud alone. Mr. Darcy said almost nothing. Mr. Hurst did say nothing, and the narrator clues us in on the fact that Darcy was divided. He admired her determination to make the trip alone, and he also thought that her rosy complexion made her look more brilliant. But he also was questioning her judgment to have come so far alone. Again, the type of thing that was allowed for a young woman to do or not do. After cleaning off the mud, she was shown up to Jane, where she attended her sister through the day. Jane, for sure, didn't seem at risk by any means, but she was feverish and had no energy to do anything other than lay in bed. After a bit, Bingley's sisters joined them, and Lizzie seemed to almost start liking them based on how attentive they were to Jane. After being there so long that Lizzie would need to start the journey back home before dark, Jane was so sad at the thought of her leaving that Miss Bingley asked Lizzie to stay with them as well. Lizzie accepted, for the sake of her sister only, and a servant was sent to Longbourn, which, by the way, that's the name of the Bennet estate, so let's get this straight. Longbourn is the Bennet family, Netherfield is where Bingley is staying, and Pemberley is where Mr. Darcy lives. I know it's a lot of names, you're going to hear them enough, you'll eventually lock in. So a servant was sent to Longbourn to retrieve some fresh clothes for Lizzie. And the next several chapters are about Lizzie's time at Netherfield while Jane is sick. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley are both very good at acting kind to your face while still making passive-aggressive comments. And then as soon as you were out of the room, they'd gossip about how you were not good enough to hang out with them. One evening while there, Elizabeth had dinner with the others before going back up to Jane's room. As soon as she was gone, Miss Bingley began to express how bad she found Miss Elizabeth's manners to be, reminding everyone of how dirty she'd looked when she'd showed up after walking for miles alone in the mud. Mr. Bingley, who was a kind man in general, but also didn't feel comfortable criticizing the sister of the woman he was falling for, refused to agree with his sister. So she turned to Darcy, positive that he would be critical of such an impropriety. "Surely you wouldn't want your sister to do something like that," she asked. "It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing," was his surprising answer. The jealousy surging in her, Miss Bingley remembered that interaction at the party and began to tease him again about Elizabeth, saying that her bad etiquette showing up like that must have changed how he thinks of her fine eyes. He says, "Not at all. They were brightened by the exercise." Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst continued to criticize the Bennet family for being poor and having no respectable relations. Bingley jumps in to defend them, saying it doesn't matter who they are related to. They are one of the most pleasant families he's ever met. And despite having just defended Elizabeth, Darcy couldn't help but comment that they may be agreeable, but their lacking of relations would impact the ability of the daughters to marry well. Lizzie soon returned to the room, so they all put on their fake smiles. While some of them were playing cards, Lizzie picked up a few books that were laying on a table. Bingley apologized for not having a great library, saying that as few books as he owns, he's read even fewer. Miss Bingley, trying to win points with Darcy, comments on how delightful the library at Pemberley is. He swelled a little at the statement. "It ought to be good," he said. "It has been the work of many generations. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these." Lizzie didn't engage in this chatter, but she just continued perusing books. Darcy noticed this, and Miss Bingley noticed Darcy noticing. So she tried to change the topic, asking about his sister and saying how she can't wait to see Georgiana again. She's so good at playing the piano. Bingley cheerfully says he is amazed how so many young ladies have the patience to become so accomplished. They paint, they knit, they play music. He says he can never hear of a young lady without being told how accomplished she is. Darcy tilted his head sarcastically as he told his friend he is exaggerating. Sure, maybe every young woman is described as being very accomplished, but he can't know more than half a dozen that actually deserve the title. Lizzie asked him what his idea of a real accomplished woman is. And between Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy, she's told that she must be able to play music, sing, draw, dance, know the modern languages, and on top of that, she must carry herself with a certain air, walk a certain way, and even the way she talks matters. And on top of all that, Darcy said seriously, she must add yet something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Elizabeth let out a mocking laugh, saying that if that's the case, she is amazed he could know half a dozen of such women. She's surprised he could know any. And again, remember, women back then did these sorts of activities and skills in order to appear attractive since they couldn't get a job. And so for a man as rich and influential as Darcy, he would have a longer list of what he was demanding in a woman as almost a filtering device. He fires back at her comment saying, "Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this?" "I never saw such a woman," she said with a raised eyebrow. The Bingley women were giggling at what they thought was surely Elizabeth turning Darcy against her. She stormed back off to check on Jane, and that's when the biggest pick-me girl in this story, Miss Bingley, and by the way, if you're not hip on the lingo, a pick-me girl is a girl who, in an effort to appear more attractive to a man, will throw other women under the bus to try and separate herself from the pack. So Miss Bingley, this story's biggest pick-me girl, ironically, then accuses Elizabeth of being a pick-me girl. Literally, what she says is kind of the definition of a pick-me girl. "Elizabeth Bennet is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, and with many men, I dare say, it succeeds, but in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art." See what I'm talking about with Jane Austen being so sharp-witted? To have someone so unaware that they are literally doing the exact thing they are accusing someone else of doing. It's just so well done. This is on par with Shakespeare. It makes me think of the scene in Hamlet where Polonius, the man who is a complete windbag whenever it comes to telling stories, says the line, quote, "Brevity is the soul of wit." But we're not done with this stay at Netherfield yet. Soon after, Mrs. Bennet showed up with Kitty and Lydia to check on her daughter and manages to stir the pot while she's there. She says Jane is far too ill to be moved home. I mean, the doctor agreed with her, but she would have said it anyway. This news dismayed the Bingley sisters, but Mrs. Bennet was delighted that her Jane would have to stay in the care of Mr. Bingley for a few days more. There's a conversation where Darcy says something snobbish and Mrs. Bennet snaps at him. She tries to walk it back, but best believe the Bingley sisters would be bringing that up later after she had left. Before she does leave, Mrs. Bennet manages to take a couple jabs at other women who might be in Bingley's atmosphere to make sure Jane stays top of mind. She called Charlotte Lucas so very plain before saying that she is such a good friend. Again, as agitating as Mrs. Bennet could be to deal with in real life, I gotta say respect for how much she is in the trenches trying to get her daughters married off favorably. After a few more moments of Lizzie being thoroughly embarrassed by her mother's lack of self-awareness, Mrs. Bennet gathered the youngest daughters to leave, but Lydia, the absolute youngest, who was a pretty rambunctious girl, did not hesitate to call up Mr. Bingley, reminding him of his promise to throw a ball at Netherfield. His answer, which he gave with a smile, was that as soon as Jane was recovered, they could name the date. Kitty and Lydia dashed off with their mother, delighted, while Lizzie avoided the gazes of the more proper folk in the room. The subplot of Miss Bingley trying to flirt with Darcy and him just not being interested in the slightest is pretty amusing, because in the next chapter, they are all in a room one evening, and Darcy is writing a letter. Miss Bingley tries to compliment him, saying, "You write uncommonly fast." His reply, "You are mistaken. I write rather slowly." But as we've already seen, Miss Bingley is not easily deterred. The group, including Mr. Bingley, start teasing Darcy about how long his letters are and how fancy he tries to sound. Bingley said, "He studies too much for words of 4 syllables." Darcy takes it on the chin, saying that his writing style is very different from his friends. This leads to a round of zingers that kind of leads to an argument between Lizzie, Darcy, and Bingley, until Bingley, being the people pleaser that he is, diffuses the discussion. Everyone moved on from it, but Lizzie noticed that for the rest of the evening, she would often catch Darcy looking at her. She didn't think it was because he was interested in her, but at the same time, to stare at someone so much if you weren't interested in them was weird, right? She decided it must be as simple as Being the lower class but independent mind that she was probably just the most curious person in the room, but she told herself that she didn't care if he liked her or not. Later that evening, when Miss Bingley was playing some songs on the piano with a lively Scottish air, Darcy approached Lizzie and said, "Don't you feel tempted, Miss Bennet, to take this chance to dance a reel?" She smiled but said nothing. He repeated the question, surprised she hadn't answered. "Oh, I heard you," she said. "I just needed a moment to decide how to reply. You wanted me to say yes, so you could mock my taste later. But I take great pleasure in ruining those kinds of plans and denying people their pre-planned judgments. So I've decided to tell you outright, I don't want to dance a reel at all. Now, go on, look down on me if you dare." "Trust me," he said, "I do not dare." Lizzie had thought that he would be put out by her calling him out so plainly, but the way he reacted threw her off guard. There was almost an element of sweetness to it. And at this point, the narrator comes in to confirm even more that Darcy was genuinely becoming bewitched by her. Quote, "He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger." Our boy is catching feels, and this fact was not lost on Caroline Bingley, who suddenly wanted Jane to get well more to get Lizzie out of the house than for actually caring about her friend. For the remainder of the Bennet sisters' stay, she kept trying to tease Darcy about the idea of Mrs. Bennet as a mother-in-law, hoping that would be distasteful enough to him to get him to change his mind. Jane was finally improved enough that they have one last night at Netherfield together before Jane and Elizabeth decide to head home. It's mostly full of more prideful conversations that show just how stuck up most of these people are. There's a really funny moment where Darcy is reading, so Miss Bingley grabs a book to try and parrot him, but she is so bored that she ends up just interrupting him frequently to ask what he's reading. Eventually, unable to put up with holding a book any longer, she asks Elizabeth to join her in a walk around the room, because being next to Lizzie was the only way to get Darcy to pay attention to her. They invite him to join, but he says there are only two possible reasons they would want to take a walk in the room, and whichever of them was the case, he was better suited to just stay sitting. When they push him to explain what he could mean, he says that either you want to share secrets and me being in earshot would ruin that, or it's because you know that your figures look the most attractive while walking, in which case he can admire them better sitting by the fire. Miss Bingley feigned shock at the statement. Elizabeth giggled. This was, from what I can tell of the time, a pretty bold thing to say. This leads to a series of exchanges that I don't think are really necessary to share in detail, but it does lead up to one exchange that feels important because it's kind of tied to the title of the book. They had been discussing the merits of teasing, or the fact that serious people can be undermined by teasing and ridicule. And jumping in at this point, Darcy is saying that it has been a focus of his to avoid the types of weaknesses that can be easily ridiculed. "Such as vanity and pride?" Lizzie asked. "Yes," Darcy said. "Vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will be always under good regulation." Interesting distinction there, right? Which feeds the idea that Darcy knows he's proud and he doesn't feel the need to change that. Elizabeth turned away with a smile at his last statement, and Miss Bingley dove in again, teasing him about how he must have no faults. He then says that he has many. His temper, for one. He's slow to forget those who have wronged him. Quote, "My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever." He and Lizzie exchange a couple more barbed comments that are secretly making them like each other, until Darcy catches himself feeling things, and he realizes he is in danger of paying Miss Elizabeth Bennet too much attention, because even if he does feel things for her, that doesn't mean he's about to act on them because of her inferior condition. To the point that the next day, when Jane and Elizabeth finally set off at home, Darcy had decided to purposefully act cold towards Elizabeth because he didn't want her getting any ideas. When the sisters got home, their mother was very disappointed to see them. She'd wished that Jane could have caught another cold. The next day, Mr. Bennet dropped a bomb on the family, announcing that there will be a new guest at their dinner table that night. The women all start guessing who he could mean, but they are disappointed when he tells them that he's never met this man before. He then says a month ago he received a letter from his cousin, Mr. Collins, who will inherit Longbourn after Mr. Bennet's death. Or, as their father so indelicately puts it, "When I am dead, he may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases." This set off his wife, of course, claiming again that her nerves are not being cared for by such mean things. She doesn't want to face the man who she sees as the biggest threat to her daughter's welfare. Remember that odd legal thing? We call it an entail, and apparently Mrs. Bennet hated it so much that she never sat down to actually hear it explained without throwing a fit. The entail was the bane of her existence. Marrying her daughters off felt like a ticking time bomb because of it. And she saw Mr. Collins as public enemy number one because of him being the heir to Longbourn. She'd never talked to him, seen him, or ever learned anything about him, but he was her devil. But, against her will, Mr. Bennet makes her and all the daughters listen to him read the letter, which I have modernized slightly so you can follow along easily. The long-standing tension between you and my late esteemed father has always caused me considerable distress. Ever since his passing, I've often wished to mend that rift. For a while, though, I hesitated, worried it might seem disloyal to his memory to be friendly with someone he took such pride in disagreeing with. In any case, I've now resolved the matter in my mind. Since being ordained at Easter, I've been fortunate enough to receive the generous patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh, whose kindness has placed me in very desirable position of rector of the parish. I am committed to serving her with the utmost respect and performing all duties of the Church of England with diligence. Furthermore, as a clergyman, I consider it my duty to promote peace and goodwill in every household I can influence. On that basis, I trust you will agree that my attempt at reconciliation is admirable, and that the awkward fact of my being next in line to inherit Longbourn estate will be graciously overlooked, and will not prevent you from accepting this olive branch. I am genuinely sorry to be the cause of any inconvenience to your lovely daughters, and offer my sincere apologies, along with the assurance that I intend to make things right, though more on that later. If you have no objection to receiving me, I plan to visit you and your family on Monday, November 18th at 4 o'clock. I expect to remain until the Saturday following, which should pose no difficulty, as Lady Catherine does not object to my occasional absence on Sundays, provided I arrange another clergyman to cover this service. I remain, dear sir, with respectful regards to your wife and daughters, your well-wisher and friend, William Collins. Jane and Elizabeth are very puzzled by the letter. What does he mean he intends to make things right? Why is he so complimentary of Lady Catherine? And how can he come across as so pompous despite being a clergyman? Is it possible he's normal despite all this? Lizzie asks aloud. Her father says he is actually quite hopeful that he is anything but normal. The mixture of arrogance and servility in the letter positions Mr. Collins to be one really weird bird, and he looks forward to witnessing it. Mrs. Bennet was somewhat calmed by the nature of the letter, and she prepared to receive the guest. We get a note that the youngest daughters, Kitty and Lydia, didn't care in the slightest, because it was almost impossible that their cousin would come in a scarlet coat, and it was now some weeks since they had received pleasure from the society of a man in any other color. Since soldiers wore red coats back then, this was a very clever way to say that they were completely obsessed with soldiers. But the way she wrote that is one of my favorite inventive lines in the book. That evening, Mr. Collins arrived. Described as a heavy-looking man of 25, his air was grave and stately, his manner formal. He was quick to compliment Mrs. Bennet on the beauty of her daughters, saying that he imagined all of them would be married soon. He also hints a little more about how he intends to solve the hardship of his fair cousins at him inheriting their family home, but still doesn't want to get into that quite yet. Mrs. Bennet, still a little suspect of him, had a hard time not listening to every compliment he gave her on the house and its wares, furniture, and decorations, without imagining that it was just him sharing his opinions as the new homeowner. After dinner, Mr. Collins went on for a long time about his benefactor, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, saying how she was so generous to him and gave him such great advice, like when she told him that he should marry soon. He said how she was so gracious to even visit him in his humble cottage, which is on her own estate. He fills them in on how she is a widow, having one daughter, Miss de Bourgh, but that despite being charming, her daughter is quite sickly. He literally talks of nothing but Lady Catherine, and he still finds a way to be boastful in his humble manner, saying how he tries to always offer those delicate little compliments which are always acceptable to ladies. Mr. Bennet, trying not to chuckle, says how lucky it is that he has the skill for flattery, and then ventures the question of if he gives those compliments out on the fly or if he plans them out in advance. Mr. Collins smiles proudly as he says that most of the time they are tailored comments to the current situation, But even the planned ones are delivered in a way that feels very natural. Mr. Bennet's expectations could not have been more fully fulfilled. His cousin was absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and except in an occasional glance at his daughter Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. The next chapter opens with a little more backstory on Mr. Collins. We learn that he's just not a self-aware guy, and neither school or social life had ever really helped him out. He spent most of his life under the thumb of a father who was both uneducated and cheap. And yes, he technically went to university, but he basically did the bare minimum and left without building any sort of useful network. His father's tight control had made him pretty meek at first, but that early humility has mostly been steamrolled by a kind of goofy self-importance, the result of him not being too strong-minded and having too much time spent alone, all compounded by this sudden confidence boost of landing into a comfort and status that he would not have expected. It was sheer luck that Lady Catherine de Bourgh had offered him the position of rector of her parish, and having that approval from a highborn was enough to, 1, make him forever her number one fan, and 2, give him a sense of self-importance that layered in with his humility in the weirdest way possible. The narrator fills us in on the fact that this plan of atonement Mr. Collins had been hinting at was to marry one of his cousins. That way, he could inherit Longbourn, but the sisters would not lose the security of the estate. He was pretty proud of himself for how generous this idea was. And as soon as he'd arrived at Longbourn, Jane's smiling face had won his affection. The next morning, he made his plans known to the mother, and Mrs. Bennet tried her best to be as polite as she could, basically saying, "Hands off Jane," claiming that she was practically engaged, but that Elizabeth wasn't spoken for. And just like that, Mr. Collins was game to set his sights on the second oldest Bennet daughter. This made Mrs. Bennet a big fan of Mr. Collins, the same man she didn't even want to hear about 24 hours ago. The daughters all set out to go into town, and Mr. Collins joins them. As soon as they got to Meryton, Lydia and Kitty were out for red-coated men. They quickly spotted one of their favorite officers, a Mr. Denny, walking with a new man who was not in uniform at the time, a man that appeared to have the attention of all of the women on the street. Mr. Denny introduced his friend as Mr. Wickham, who had just joined their corps the day before. This next line cracks me up. Quote, "This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming." Or, in other words, putting that man in uniform was the only way to make him even more desirable. He was handsome, well-dressed, charming, and seemed at ease in conversation with anybody he met. But it was while he was getting to know the Bennet sisters that Bingley and Mr. Darcy came through, supposedly on their way to Longbourn to check on Jane. Darcy seemed to be purposefully avoiding looking at Lizzie, but Lizzie did see how his eyes locked on the new, handsome stranger. She saw Wickham notice Darcy as well. The two men stared at each other. Quote, "Both changed color. One looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham tipped his hat to Darcy eventually. Darcy barely nodded his head in return." Lizzie was dumbfounded. What could this mean? The sisters proceeded to spend some time in town. They visited their aunt, Mrs. Phillips, who said that she would host a gathering soon with the officers, including Mr. Wickham, and that the girls should all come, which made Lydia and Kitty very happy. When they got home, Lizzie rolled her eyes as she listened to her cousin, Mr. Collins, explain to her mother how pleased he was by the manners of Mrs. Phillips and her politeness. He said that, excepting Lady Catherine and her daughter, he'd never seen a more elegant woman. Side note, I watched 4 different adaptations of this story during my research phase. We'll talk about them in more detail at the end of the episode. But one thing that all 4 nailed was the casting of Mr. Collins. He was slightly different in each, but in every one, he was the same guy. Awkward and unaware, bordering on a lovable mixture of humility and pride. One of the following evenings, the 5 sisters and Mr. Collins all found themselves at their aunt and uncle's, the Phillipses, for a party where a lot of officers, including Mr. Wickham, were enjoying themselves. Wickham and Elizabeth start to get pretty chummy really fast. He seemed to want to spend time with her, and she found him to be the most agreeable man she talked to for quite a while. He was so great of a conversationalist that Elizabeth felt that, quote, "the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic might be rendered interesting by the skill of the speaker." Mr. Collins, unfortunately, found that he was not the desired companion for conversations of anyone except Mrs. Phillips at this party. Card games popped up, and most people found themselves in clusters of conversations, leaving Wickham and Lizzie to speak more privately, which is when the officer asked her how long Mr. Darcy had been staying in Netherfield. Lizzie tells him about a month, and then mentions that she has heard that his own estate in Derbyshire is quite significant. Wickham sighs defeatedly and says his estate does clear more than $10,000 a year, and that, quote, "You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you certain information on the head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a particular manner from my infancy." Basically saying, I know all about Mr. Darcy. Lizzie was shocked, but now the exchange of glances she'd witnessed between Darcy and Wickham seemed to promise an even more interesting story. Wickham seems to be hinting that he has a lot of dirt on Darcy, but he is obliged to not share it because of the connection that they have between them. But he says that he's known the man too long to ever be an impartial judge about him, so it's best for him to not share his judgments. Lizzie gets even more curious when Wickham says that his reservations about casting Darcy in a bad light are because the man's father, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend that Mr. Wickham had ever had. And although the younger Mr. Darcy's treatment of him has been terrible, he would rather endure it than do anything that might disgrace the memory of the late Mr. Darcy. Now that is one way to make people desperate to know your story. He slowly reveals more, saying he was supposed to have a career in the church, that Darcy's father had promised him the position the next time it opened up, which would have provided a comfortable life for him. But when Darcy's father unfortunately passed away before the position opened up, the younger Mr. Darcy chose to ignore his father's wishes when it finally did open up and gave the position to someone else. Wickham says he hasn't been able to figure out what he did to make Darcy dislike him so much, but that, quote, "Till I can forget his father, I can never defy or expose him." Lizzie melts at the nobleness of this poor soldier who was jilted out of a better life by such a scoundrel as Darcy. She pushes Wickham for more, saying there has to be some reason for Darcy's dislike, even if it's unjustified. Wickham then confesses that it's because the elder Mr. Darcy loved him more than his own son. They had a bond that Fitzwilliam, yes, even though it's almost never used in the book, that is Mr. Darcy's first name, Fitzwilliam. But Wickham and Mr. Darcy's father had a bond that the current Mr. Darcy envied. Lizzie sat there, stunned, but then she remembered that day at Netherfield, when Darcy had said himself that his unforgiving temper and unwillingness to restore his good opinion once lost was his flaw. And it kind of made sense. After sharing several more sharp comments about Darcy, which made Elizabeth feel even more justified in loathing the prideful man, they shift to other topics. First, they talk about how her cousin Mr. Collins is connected to Lady Catherine de Burgh, and Wickham offhandedly mentions that Darcy is actually Lady Catherine's nephew, and it's believed that he is intended to marry Lady Catherine's daughter, who is his first cousin, but we've covered enough books from this time, you know what this is about. This made Lizzie laugh, thinking how hard Miss Caroline Bingley had been trying to win him over, if all along he was destined to marry another. Felt like justice in her mind. On the carriage ride home that night, Kitty and Lydia wouldn't stop giggling about the officers and the games that they'd played together. Mr. Collins wouldn't shut up about the generous hospitality of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, repeating every little detail to his cousins. But Lizzie sat there, silent, a little smile on her face as she thought about Mr. Wickham, a man who suffered much and still was capable of smiling through it all. What an impressive man. There's a very brief transition chapter talking about the ladies of Longbourn getting ready for the ball at Netherfield. There's anticipation about Jane and Bingley. Lizzie is excited to see Wickham again. Kitty and Lydia are completely giddy, as you can imagine. And even Mary seems open to the idea. She says something about how as long as she can keep her morning schedule, she has no qualm against an occasional evening engagement. But the biggest development in this chapter is that Lizzie first catches wise to the idea that her cousin intends to propose to her. She casually asked Mr. Collins, probably because she knew whatever his answer to this question would be amusing, if he was going to the ball, and if so, if he felt like dancing was proper for a clergyman. His answer did not disappoint. "I am by no means of the opinion, I assure you, that a ball of this kind, given by a young man of character to respectable people, can have any evil tendency, and I am so far from objecting to dancing myself, that I shall hope to be honored with the hands of all my fair cousins in the course of the evening, and I shall take this opportunity of soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances, especially a preference which I trust my cousin Jane will attribute to the right causes and not to any disrespect for her. This was a huge bummer because Lizzie had been planning on Wickham having the first two dances, but etiquette dictated that she couldn't say no. The first man to ask you for a dance was supposed to be given the right. But the tone with which he'd said this is what most disturbed her. It was the first time she'd considered that he was singling her out to be the mistress of Hunsford Parsonage, where she would have to spend a life sucking up to Lady Catherine. And from that point on, she began to notice how Mr. Collins treated her differently than any of her sisters. She became almost certain that a proposal was coming, but she decided until it actually happened, there was no use talking about it. Okay, we have reached the Netherfield Ball chapter. I'm just going to invite you to pay close attention to what happens in this setting. I'm not giving any more hints than that, but this night will have lasting impact, so listen up. Elizabeth showed up to the ball having taken a bit more extra care to look nice. She usually prided herself on not primping too much, but tonight she had felt like making the effort. She was searching the entire interior of the estate looking for Mr. Wickham, but could not find him in the crowd. She wondered if Darcy had made Bingley not invite him. They bump into his friend Mr. Denny, who sadly announced that Wickham had to leave town on business, but he slyly hints that he thinks the business could have waited if it wasn't for the presence of a certain gentleman here that night. Lizzie instinctively shot a dirty glare Darcy's direction. She decided at that moment to not try to be nice around Darcy any longer, because, quote, attendance, forbearance, patience with Darcy was injury to Wickham. But pretty soon her distaste for Darcy was replaced by the horror of remembering her first two dances were promised to Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, awkward and solemn, apologizing instead of attending, and often moving wrong without being aware of it, gave her all the shame and misery which a disagreeable partner for a couple of dances could give. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. And after dancing with a couple officers, she was tucked away in a corner of the room, gossiping with Charlotte Lucas, and was stunned when she turned around to find Mr. Darcy standing there. He asked for the next dance. Unable to think, Lizzie instinctively said yes. He then walked away instead of waiting until the dance started. Lizzie starts to panic. Charlotte tries to comfort her, saying that she bets Lizzie will even find him agreeable. But Lizzie says that's the worst thing that could happen, to start feeling positive things for someone you have sworn to hate. As the music for the next dance started, Darcy approached Lizzie. Charlotte whispered one last warning to behave as she almost pushed Elizabeth in his direction. They danced in silence for some time. It felt awkward to Lizzie. At first she thought maybe she'd get away without having to say a word to him the entire time, until she decided it would be more of a punishment for him if she made him engage in small talk. So she made a comment about the dance, he replied briefly, and there was silence again. After a minute more, she teased him. "It's your turn to say something, Mr. Darcy. Make a remark about the size of the room or number of couples." He smiled a little and said whatever she wished him to say, he would say. She made another smart remark before he finally volunteered his own contribution to the chat. "Do you talk by rule, then, while you were dancing, Miss Bennet?" They then exchange a few lines back and forth that fall into that category of things that could be hostile criticisms or flirtatious jokes. And in case at this point you're thinking, this dance is super long, it turns out that Regency-era line dances were often 10 to 20 minutes, so if you had two dances together, that could be like half an hour of quote-unquote private time. That's why it is a big deal when a man asks for two dances. But after a bit, the conversation leads to Darcy asking if Elizabeth and her sisters often walked to Meryton. This triggered something in Lizzie. This was her chance to bring up Wickham and see if she could get under Darcy's fingernails while acting innocent to the ugly truth of his connection to the man. She says that when they met up the other day, they had just made a new acquaintance. Darcy went a light shade of red, and after a pause, he said, "Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain." Lizzie snapped. "He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship, and in a manner which he is likely to suffer from all his life." Luckily for Darcy, they were interrupted by Sir William Lucas, who mentioned how fine they looked as a dancing duo, and then made a comment to Lizzie about how well things seemed to be going between a certain couple. He was eyeing Jane and Bingley as he spoke. When Lizzie looked at Darcy, he was also looking at the pair, but there was a colder gaze on his face than Sir Lucas's. But Sir Lucas left and they returned to their dance. Darcy tried to shake off the previous topic. Lizzie tells him it's fine that they have nothing to talk about. They've already tried multiple topics and failed. "What think you of books?" Darcy said with a large grin, trying to appear amiable. Note, maybe that should become my go-to pickup line. I don't know. What do you think? Should I just walk up to beautiful women in Barnes & Noble and say, "What think you of books?" It might be a winner. But Lizzie teased that there is no way they read the same types of books. He tries to say that in that case, their opposing tastes should be a topic of conversation, but she just shrugged it off. Their dance ended and they parted ways. Lizzie relieved to be done with it. Darcy with a growing feeling of desire in his chest. To complicate things even more, Miss Caroline Bingley came over to Lizzie afterward and said she'd heard that she was taking a fancy to Mr. Wickham, and without having specific details, she warns her against believing anything Wickham says, saying that he is the one who wronged Darcy in, quote, a most infamous manner. But as you can imagine, Elizabeth was not so easily swayed by Mr. Darcy's number one fan. Of course, Miss Bingley would take his side. This only made her loathe Darcy even more. The only thing that brought her back down to earth was finding Jane and seeing how sweet and pure her happiness was at this ball. After getting updates from Jane about her interactions with Mr. Bingley that night, Mr. Collins interrupted to say that he had just learned that the nephew of his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, is in attendance, which, if you remember, is Darcy, and that he must go introduce himself. Lizzie is terrified. In polite society, you don't just go up to people that you don't know. You needed an introduction from a mutual party. And maybe if you were someone extra smooth and charming, you could get away with it. But this is Mr. Collins we're talking about, so you can see why Lizzie is petrified. She tried to convince him to not go over there on his own, but Mr. Collins listened to her with the determined air of following his own inclination. He tells his cousin that he understands her concerns, but as a member of the clergy, he is just as dignified as a lord, and therefore he must follow his own conscience, which tells him he has a duty to make himself known to the blood relative of his beloved patroness. He then apologizes that he must ignore his cousin's advice, which in every other occasion he would hold in the utmost regard. And with a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose reception of his advances Lizzie eagerly watched. She saw how astonished Mr. Darcy was when he found himself being addressed by the man. They were standing far enough away that she couldn't hear anything they were saying, but just watching was enough. Mr. Collins was being everything you would expect Mr. Collins to be, and Darcy looked polite, but it was obvious he was pretty annoyed by the interruption. The night got worse when, later, Lizzie was with her mother, who was speaking to Mrs. Lucas. Mrs. Bennet was proudly talking about the all but certainty of Jane's marrying Mr. Bingley, and how such an advantageous marriage would certainly improve the other daughter's odds of marrying other rich men. When Lizzie saw that Mr. Darcy was more than likely in earshot of the conversation, she tried to shut her mother up, but her mother, whether from being drunk or just being annoyed at being told what to do, scolded Lizzie's efforts, saying, "What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear." Lizzie, practically yelling through her whispered tones, said there is also no advantage to offending Mr. Darcy, hinting that Bingley is such close friends with the man, you don't want to become his enemy. But her mother continued on, and Lizzie watched Darcy, who never looked in her mother's direction, but acted in such a way she was sure he had been listening to everything that had been said. And just when Lizzie had somewhat recovered from that ordeal, her social anxiety returned as Mary started playing the piano and singing. Nobody had asked her to, and from the looks of many in the room, it was apparent that no one really wanted her to keep going. But for Mary, who, as we've already established, needs chances to exhibit her values, she was not going to pass up the chance to perform in public. But elaborating on what was already mentioned, she doesn't have a strong voice, and despite all her practicing, she doesn't look very casual as she's playing. She looks pretty tense, so everyone watching her felt strained by her effort. Mary didn't seem to mind, however, and launched right into a second song almost immediately after the first, despite having been met with only half-hearted applause. Elizabeth was tortured by the situation. She looked to Jane for help, but Jane was already talking to Bingley. Lizzie saw her other sisters completely unaware of the damage to their family's reputation, and she caught one more glimpse of Darcy, who seemed to be taking in the scene with the same gravity that he looked at every scene. Finally, she found her father and asked him to do something. He took the hint, and as soon as the second song ended, he loudly announced, "That will do extremely well, child. You have delighted us long enough. Let the other ladies have time to exhibit." Mary tried to act like she hadn't noticed, but it was obvious she was hurt. Lizzie immediately felt guilty for having run interference. She wished her father had handled it more tactfully. The cherry on top of all of this was Mr. Collins announcing loudly to all who would listen how if he had taken music lessons, he would have been quite good, but as a member of clergy, he was too busy to pursue all things of interest to him. Lizzie's head was about to explode. Could anyone in her family, besides Sweet Jane, of course, not be a source of complete humiliation to her? To Elizabeth, it appeared that her family had made an agreement to embarrass themselves as much as possible during the evening. And in Lizzie's opinion, it would have been impossible for them to play their parts any better. What we've covered was the worst of it, although it was not the last instance. At one point, she watched her mom try to force conversation with the Bingley sisters, who were obviously not interested. Later, Mr. Collins was having one of his long-winded compliment sessions to the Bingley family of what a wonderful ball they threw. The only moment of peace she got the entire night was when she saw Jane and Bingley standing off from the crowd together, each of them smiling as they spoke in secret tones. The Bennets were among the last to leave the party because Mrs. Bennet had wanted a chance to invite Bingley over for dinner any time. His sisters shot dirty glances at her, but he, of course, smiled graciously and thanked her for the offer. As they rode home, Mama Bennet was ecstatic about how the evening had gone. In her mind, she was already planning Jane's wedding, and secretly was starting to plan a second wedding between her second oldest and the awkward cousin who would inherit the estate of Longport. Lizzie woke up the next morning with an embarrassment hangover. If only last night had been a dream, but the memories were way too vivid to not be real. While sitting at the table for breakfast, Mr. Collins asked Mrs. Bennet if he could talk to Elizabeth in private. Mrs. Bennet knew what this meant. Lizzie knew what this meant, which is why she protested so much when her mother began to clear out all her sisters from the room. She tried to leave herself, but her mother ordered her to sit and listen to Mr. Collins. As soon as they were alone, Collins launched in with his particular taste of weird compliments. He basically says he's more attracted to her because of her hesitancy to be alone with him, which I think is a matter of propriety. Like, since it was considered often taboo for unmarrieds to be alone, he read her hesitancy to be alone out of chasteness. And he assures her that he has her mother's permission for this conversation. He began saying, "Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life." Which, don't forget, he asked for Jane's hand first, but got shot down by Mrs. Bennet. He then expresses 3 reasons for why he desires to marry. First, every clergyman should be married to set the example of marriage in his parish. Second, he is convinced it will make him personally happier. And third, he notes that maybe he should have said this one first. It is the advice of his very noble lady patroness, saying that he's been given the advice to find an active, useful sort of person. He then, predictably, paints his closeness to Lady Catherine as a perk of marrying him, saying that she has promised to come visit whoever he marries. And after he shares his motivation to marry a cousin to keep Longbourn in the family, he says nothing remains but to, quote, assure her in the most animated language of the violence of his affections. But just imagine his line being delivered in an almost monotone format. Lizzie had been biting her lip, waiting for a chance to interrupt him, but finally had to cut him off when he started talking as if the proposal had already been accepted. "You are too hasty, sir," she cried out. "I have not given you an answer, and let me do it before you say anything else. Thank you for the honor you pay me by making this offer, but I cannot say yes." Almost not skipping a beat, Collins starts talking about how he is aware that it is common for young ladies to reject the advances of a man that she secretly wants to say yes to, but wants him to make a second or third attempt. So he is not discouraged. Lizzie protests that she is not one of those women. Quote, "I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced I am the last woman in the world who could make you so." She promises him that in the face of her refusal, he can feel his duty to try to keep Longbourn and the Bennet family fulfilled. He should not feel guilty taking his affection somewhere else. But he is undeterred, saying, "When I do myself the honor of speaking to you next on the subject, I shall hope to receive a more favorable answer." He's convinced that this outright denial is part of the courtship ritual and is trying to show how dead set he is on pushing through, although at this point, he resorts to some level of attempted manipulation, noting that it's not a guarantee Lizzie will ever receive another proposal of marriage. "I shall choose to attribute your rejection to a wish of increasing my love by suspense, according to the usual practice of elegant females," he said. Lizzie says she wishes he would rather trust her that she was being sincere in her rejection. She does not wish to torment a respectable man. Now, we never get inside Collins's head, so we can't know for certain just how obtuse he is in this moment, but he seems to make a tactical retreat, claiming that he now thinks that he just needs her father's approval on top of her mother's in order to make Lizzie see this offer as acceptable, and he quietly leaves the room. You remember when I said Pride and Prejudice was a war story? Well, it's not. It's a comedy. Jane Austen writes with such a sharpness that reading chapters like this one make me feel like I'm watching an episode of Frasier. And I love Frasier, by the way. It's the wittiest sitcom of my lifetime. But her subtext and masked themes weren't always about being critical. Sometimes it was just about pointing out how ridiculous life could be in this society. The idea that a reasonable woman should be expected to say yes to a man as ludicrous as this just because he will inherit her family estate may be logical based on the times, but at an interpersonal level, it's insane, especially for our evolved modern sensibilities. In addition to Mr. Collins, the entire character of Mrs. Bennet is a never-ending gag reel, and even the stuffiest characters like Mr. Darcy find themselves in situations that make you chuckle to yourself as you read it. If Jane were alive today, she'd be just as capable of writing sitcoms as novels based in social critique. When Mr. Collins left the room, Mrs. B, who had been hiding out close to the dining room, waiting for the joyous news, quickly congratulated her new son-in-law. Mr. Collins says that Lizzie had been too modest to accept his first offer. But as you can guess from what we've heard about Mrs. Bennet to this point, this was unacceptable. "Depend on it, Mr. Collins," she said as her face set in a grim determination. "Lizzie shall be brought to reason. She is a headstrong and foolish girl, but I will make her see things our way." Despite having just experienced Lizzie's headstrong nature firsthand a few seconds ago, it's only hearing her own mother label her as such that for the first time Collins finds himself saying, actually, maybe if she is headstrong and foolish, she wouldn't make a desirable wife for a man in my position. I'm looking for happiness in my marriage. But Mrs. B is quick to calm him down, saying that Lizzie is a good-natured girl in all general matters. It's only ones like this where she needs to be brought around. But instead of actually talking to her daughter, she first goes to her husband, saying that he needs to come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins. Mr. B, who had not been part of the earlier conversations with Mr. Collins, had no idea what she meant by this. And after his wife filled him in, he asked her to call Lizzie and he will share his opinion. Lizzie reluctantly entered her father's study. "So Mr. Collins has proposed to you?" "Yes." "And you've said no?" "Yes." "And your mother is insisting on you changing your mind?" "Yes, or I will never see her again," Mrs. B chimed in. "An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day, you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." A large smile appeared on Lizzie's face as Mrs. B took a second to realize what her husband had just said, but her emotions quickly flared up as she pieced it together. Her mom spends the rest of that morning persuading Lizzie, threatening her, trying to make her see the light, because, brief pause, even though the whole point of Mrs. B's character is to be ridiculous to the point of being funny, she is coming from a very natural maternal instinct to make sure her kids are taken care of. And having one of her daughters marry Mr. Collins was the best way to promise that none of her daughters would end up on the street. So we can have a little grace for her behavior, even if she is absolutely unbearable in her tantrums. When Charlotte Lucas shows up later to visit her friend, Mrs. B falls on her immediately. "Nobody is on my side. Nobody takes part with me. I am cruelly used. Nobody feels for my poor nerves." Charlotte was too stunned to even reply to her friend's mom, but luckily Lizzie whisked her off and filled her in on why her mother was so upset. After having disappeared for a few hours, Mr. Collins popped in to talk with Mr. B, and to his credit, the same attributes of clueless confidence that made him intolerable at other points made him take the rejection on the chin, and he bounces back like a champ. He assured Mrs. Bennet that he was all right and that he is already experiencing that clarity that comes after being denied a blessing where you realize the blessing you were looking for was not what you really wanted. But he assures her that this does not mean he thinks Lizzie less impressive of a young lady, but that he was just hoping to find himself a companion that would secure the Bennet family, and he asks that if his behavior has been at all unfavorable, he begs forgiveness. You kind of got to feel bad for the guy, even if you totally are on Lizzie's side that she should have said no. He's such a unique pairing of that arrogant and humble that, I don't know, you just have to kind of like him. And that sequence is actually a very important and interesting section of the story. A couple things I want to highlight. We have the two most ridiculous characters in the story, Mrs. B and Mr. Collins, both aligned on trying to do the thing that, at that time and in that setting, was technically the right thing to do. Not only economically, but morally. I think the Regency period read on this situation would have determined that Mr. Collins's intention was honorable and the best option for the Bennet family. And obviously, Mrs. B's desperate desire to secure her daughter's future is honorable. So, how radical it was for Austen back at this time to make the right thing to do come from the least serious characters in a way that makes you kind of feel like it isn't the right thing to do. Because we side with Elizabeth pretty naturally. Your instinct is to support the person choosing free will and holding out for a favorable match. To our 21st century minds, this feels obvious. But for early 19th century society, Lizzie would have been in the wrong to many. To choose yourself over your family, which is to some extent literally what she did here, she chose to hold out for a genuine connection and marital love at the cost of rolling the dice that her sisters might be homeless in a theoretical future. So we need to soak in how serious this moment was. Mr. Collins's proposal is one of the more laughable scenes because of Austen's sharp satirical abilities. But in terms of the story arc, there are very heavy implications to be taken from this scene. In the language we use on this show, Lizzie has made a choice that goes directly against her tribe. And although her mother is already threatening to cut her off, most of her family are supporting her in this. But if Lizzie continually chooses herself over others, at some point, even her father or Jane might decide that she's not pulling her weight as a tribe member and needs to be cut loose. I guess a quick spoiler, that's not what happens in this story, but I just wanted to pause and theoretically play out how there could be a path where if Mr. Bennet died and Collins took over the house, he could potentially do so in a way that vindictively kicked all the sisters out after Lizzie had rejected him, and you can bet most of her sisters, and definitely her mother, would blame her for everything in that situation. So, it's a fun section to read because it's written with such unserious tones, but that is masking a plot choice that might have felt almost scandalous for the time. To choose your own desire for love over security was selfish and unthinkable. But also, maybe that's why this story became so popular? Anyway, we now get to what I'm calling the bridge chapters because they themselves are way less action-packed than the sections I want to focus on, but they do bridge the gap from where we are to where we want to be. So I will just mention the events that you need to know to be up to speed when we jump back in. But I will say, if you take the time to read this book yourself, which you should, you'll find value in some of these chapters that I am having to skip over because I just don't have the time to incorporate them. So yeah, you should read this book sometime. First off, Jane gets a letter from Miss Caroline Bingley saying her brother had to go to London on business, and they decided to follow him, leaving Netherfield empty. She suggests they may not be back for a long time, if ever, and also does it in a way that seems to purposefully try to ruin Jane's hopes of ever marrying Bingley by stating that she is hopeful that he marries Darcy's sister. And after listing out a whole list of reasons why she thinks that union is desirable, she says, "Am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging a hope of an event which will secure the happiness of so many?" What a brilliant line of manipulation, because she's basically saying, why would you think you should marry my brother when him marrying someone else would make a lot of people much happier than if he married you? Suddenly, it's not about Jane's desires because they are being weighed against a larger group of people's desires. In a utilitarian sense, she is being made to feel selfish for wishing to marry Bingley herself. Lizzie is suspect of the whole thing, though, telling her sister not to believe anything that Miss Bingley says. Anyone who has seen Jane and Bingley together knows there's something there. Afterwards, Lizzie is shocked to learn that Charlotte Lucas, her oldest friend, has become engaged to her cousin, Mr. Collins. We learn a sad truth about Charlotte that paints her as one of the foils, and in case you need a refresher, a foil is a character who is designed to be the opposite of one of your leads so that they stand out. And one of the geniuses of the story is that the main characters have several foils. But in this case, where Lizzie turned down the sensible marriage in pursuit of a more real love, Charlotte doesn't believe in love. Without thinking highly either of men or matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only provision for a well-educated young woman of a small fortune. and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. Meaning, she was far from being a romantic, but she was focused on the economics of marriage, and Mr. Collins could at least offer her that. Lizzie and Charlotte have almost an argument where Lizzie feels that this choice is the wrong one, and Charlotte calls her out on her privilege of feeling that she has enough options to have turned Collins down. Remember, Charlotte is like 7 years older than Lizzie. But if you love the movie and haven't read the book, I regret to inform you that the "I am 27 years old, I've no money and no prospects" speech is not directly from the book. Neither is the "Don't you dare judge me, Lizzie," which is interesting because so many of the greatest lines in the film adaptation are direct quotes from Jane's words. So it feels like that one kind of should be. But Lizzie leaves the interaction unsatisfied. She's always known her and Charlotte looked at marriage differently, but she could not have comprehended someone sacrificing every better feeling just for financial security. She was sad knowing that Charlotte would never actually be happy in a marriage to Mr. Collins. As you can guess, Mrs. B did not take the news well either. She was freshly angry with Lizzie. She gossips about how the Lucases have always been deceptive types, just like them to steal Longbourn out from under them. She makes a comment to her husband about how terrible she finds the idea of having to make way for Charlotte Collins to take her house away from her. In his usual dry wit, Mr. B says that they should focus on happier thoughts, like the possibility of him outliving Mr. Collins. Meanwhile, Lizzie is starting to be concerned if Mr. Bingley might actually not be interested in Jane. There's been no word from him for weeks now. They get another letter from Miss Bingley confirming the entire group is settled in London for winter. No one will be coming back to Netherfield anytime soon. Jane obviously took this hard, but Lizzie took it badly as well. Something was off. Her heart was split between empathetic concern for her sister and resentment against everybody else. It was bad enough that Caroline seemed to be trying to hurt Jane with these letters, but why had Bingley never reached out himself? It defied everything she knew about the man and what she had witnessed about his intentions to Jane. It felt unreal that he would leave without saying anything and not writing her. Jane tried to be a champ through it all, claiming that she was over Bingley, but it's obvious she's just saying this to cover her true feelings. One of the only things that helped with all the sadness and frustration were the frequent visits of Mr. Wickham. Between knowing what Mr. Wickham thought of Darcy and her own suspicions of Darcy somehow being involved in Bingham's disappearance, this sealed his fate in terms of Lizzie's opinion of Darcy. And she wasn't alone. Everybody, and by everyone I mean everyone except Jane because she's too forgiving and optimistic, Mr. Darcy was condemned to be the worst of men. It was almost the Christmas season, which meant Mrs. B's brother and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, came to visit. Mrs. Gardner was much younger than Mrs. Bennet or their aunt, Mrs. Phillips, so she was like the cool aunt, closer in age to the elder daughters, so they treated her as one of their confidants. Lizzie filled in Mrs. Gardner on all the Jane Bingley drama, and when Mrs. Gardner asked for the evidence that Mr. Bingley was actually in love with Jane, we get this great line where Lizzie says he was so focused on Jane at the ball that he actually offended several women who sought his attention. Quote, "Is not general incivility the very essence of love?" But Mrs. Gardner is really curious about Lizzie's attention to Mr. Wickham. Lizzie tries to downplay it, saying she's not in love, but admitting that she does feel something about him, and she can only promise to try and not be as hasty in developing feelings for him as other people seem to be doing around her. It's decided that Jane is going to go with the Gardners and stay in London for some time to take her mind off of things. Around the same time, Charlotte and Mr. Collins have gotten married, and before she left for her new home, Charlotte begged Lizzie to promise and come and visit soon. So Lizzie spends some weeks at home without her older sister or her closest friend, exchanging letters. She gets letters from Jane claiming that she's over Bingley, but Lizzie has her doubts. She gets letters from Charlotte describing her life as the rector's wife and what it's been like living in the atmosphere of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lizzie feels even more curious to see this woman for herself. She also gets letters from her cool aunt, Mrs. Gardner, asking for updates about Lizzie and Wickham. But she is forced to disappoint her aunt by saying that Mr. Wickham seems to have set his sights on a new young woman whose greatest charm in Lizzie's mind is that she has just come to inherit £10,000. But she writes her aunt saying that she now knows she was not in love with him because she doesn't feel very jilted by him taking his attention to this Miss King. And she doesn't resent Miss King either. She thinks Kitty and Lydia have taken the news harder than she has. But a few months pass, and March arrives, which is when Lizzie had promised to visit Charlotte. enough time had passed that she missed her friend, and she was willing to put up with the idea of having to stay in the same house as Mr. Collins for a time. Quote, there was a novelty in the scheme. But she plotted her travels by way of visiting Jane in London at the Gardiners on the way. She is eager to catch up with her sister, but at the first chance, she wants to be alone with her aunt to get the straight dope on how Jane is doing. Mrs. Gardiner talks about how Jane has tried to communicate with Miss Bingley, and that it was so disappointing to realize that Miss Bingley had, quote, given up the acquaintance. It was impossible to tell if it was because she was just bored with Jane or if it was because she was trying to keep her away from her brother. But this action was cruel to Jane either way. Her aunt is eager to ask about this Miss King that Mr. Wickham is suddenly interested in. Lizzie tries to brush it off, but Mrs. Gardiner points out that there is a certain indelicacy in the fact that his attentions were fixed on her so immediately after she inherited all that money. He's in tough circumstances, Lizzie said. She's trying to defend her one-time interest and still friend by saying that he has a right to be interested in settling a more secure financial path for himself. If she doesn't object to it, why should we? Her aunt replies saying just because she doesn't object doesn't justify his motives. And after all this talk of different men who might have brought a Bennet sister happiness but appear to be uninterested, Lizzie stands up, telling her aunt that I am sick of them all. Thank heaven I am going tomorrow where I shall find a man who has not one agreeable quality, talking about Mr. Collins, who has neither manner nor sense to recommend him. Stupid men are the only ones worth knowing after all. And if that statement does make you feel kind of bad for Mr. Collins, don't worry, we're about to get into several more chapters of him reminding you how much he kind of deserves it. When she traveled to Rosings Park, the estate of Lady Catherine, the next day, she is quick to find Mr. Collins is no different as a married man. It took several minutes of him asking the most detailed questions about everyone back home before he even let her in the gate. And when they finally got inside, he welcomed her again. He seemed to be presenting his home to her almost with an air of, look at everything that you're missing out on. She watched Charlotte, aka Mrs. Collins, closely to see how she reacted whenever her husband said something embarrassing. Once or twice, Lizzie could see her cheeks blush a bit, but for the most part, it looked like Charlotte had just developed the ability to tune him out. Of course, sooner than later, the conversation turns to Lady Catherine de Bourgh and how they dine at her place twice a week and how she refuses to let them walk home, sending them in her carriage. Wait, check that. One of her carriages, because she has several. Charlotte humbly adds her own testament that Lady Catherine is a very attentive neighbor, proven by the fact that within hours of Elizabeth arriving, an invitation to dine with her the following evening is sent to the clergyman's home. So the next day, as they were gearing up to visit Lady Catherine, Mr. Collins took great pride in offering advice about how to behave as the most experienced there in dealing with Lady Catherine. As unaware of himself as ever, he tells Lizzie to not worry about how plain her dress is, that Lady Catherine will not think less of her for being simply dressed. She likes to have the distinction of rank preserved. Actually, that's a great time to pause and point out something. By this point in the book, Mr. Collins has at several times remarked on the, quote, generous condescension of Lady Catherine, and that threw me off. Like, what? To be condescended to is a good thing here? And it only took a little researching to learn that the term condescending has gone through a transformation in the last couple hundred years. Because back in times like the aristocracy, where it was commonly believed and accepted that there were people of higher rank, obviously there are people who still think themselves better than others today, but back then the difference was the lower classes actually kind of bought into the idea. So when a noble could be bothered to be attentive to, and especially if they helped out someone below them, they were condescending, which based on my understanding of Latin languages actually means to descend with being the key word there. They were coming down to your level as the less noble, so that they could be with you, physically or at least in thought, whatever the circumstance was. So Mr. Collins's remarks on her amazing condescension is referring to her gracious ability to be concerned for the lower classes. But over the last couple hundred years, most people have pushed for more egalitarian ideas. The belief that noble-borns were such because they were factually superior to others became unpopular. And with it, the idea that it was such a blessing if they chose to lower themselves to be with the ignoble. And so, the idea of being condescended to went from being a claim of generosity to insulting patronization. And that line from Collins only adds to this idea that the higher-ups may like to help out the lower classes, but only as long as it's accepted that they are doing it out of a merciful heart and not a belief that you are equals deserving equal treatment. Again, that line was, she likes to have the distinction of rank preserved, suggesting that Lizzie dressing plainly will make Lady Catherine feel more comfortable with it being known that they are not the same. I can almost imagine Elizabeth rolling her eyes at this. The evening is off to a bad start for her, as they couldn't go more than 20 feet without Mr. Collins having some new praise to bestow on Lady Catherine for her well-kept grounds, her top-class servants, her choice in art. When they meet her, Lady Catherine is described as a tall, large woman with strongly marked features, which may have been beautiful at some point in time. She carried herself in a way that made it so it didn't matter if she spoke to you welcomingly. It was obvious she was of higher rank than you. She spoke with a very authoritative tone, drenched in self-importance. Miss de Burgh, the sickly daughter, was also there. She didn't look anything like her mother and barely spoke, but she was pleasant enough to be around. The dinner was as elegant as any meal Lizzie had ever eaten, but things didn't get juicy until after dinner, when Lady Catherine suddenly had a lot of questions for Lizzie. "Do you play and sing, Miss Bennet?" "A little," was the reply. "Then you must play for us some day. Do your sisters play as well?" This turns into a conversation where it seems Lady Catherine is scrutinizing Elizabeth's entire upbringing. She's shocked to find out that all 5 of her sisters are out at the same time. And by out, it basically means like on the market. It wasn't uncommon for a house with several daughters to kind of keep the younger ones out of social life until the older ones were married. Lady Catherine is shocked to find that they were raised without a governess. And when Lizzie has quick answers that are all a bit defiant to these inquiries from Lady Catherine, the noblewoman remarks to Lizzie that she sure does give her opinions very decidedly for so young a person. The evening continued on in a slightly awkward tension of feeling like things should be casual, but no one had the ability to be at ease around Lady Catherine. Almost like if you went to a party at the home of the head of your HR department. When they finally left for home, Charlotte was eager to ask Lizzie her thoughts on Lady Catherine. And Lizzie gave a couple half-hearted compliments to try and not appear rude, but what she said was clearly not enough for Mr. Collins, who began to supply his own long list of compliments for his patroness. So Lizzie settled in for a few weeks of what became fairly routine. Pleasant days with her old friend where she just had to put up with ramblings of her cousin from time to time. And every few days they got another invitation to go to Rosings Park, where Lizzie got to play grateful poor girl to Lady Catherine's condescensions. She pieces together that the lady's greatest pride was in giving her opinion to everyone, which led to her being overly involved in the lives of everyone in her parish. An odd and very self-important behavior. But at a certain point, Lizzie gets a bit of news. Mr. Darcy is coming to visit. At first, she was very displeased at the news, but ultimately decided that after weeks of the same half-dozen faces, it would at least be refreshing to throw someone else into the mix. Besides, if he was truly intended to marry his cousin Miss de Burgh, she would take a lot of pleasure in watching him interact with his intended wife, knowing that Miss Bingley had thrown herself at the man in vain for so long. The same afternoon that they'd gotten word of his arrival, he actually paid a visit to the parsonage. He was not alone. He brought a cousin with him, a Colonel Fitzwilliam, a seemingly pleasant man in uniform. Colonel Fitzwilliam was quite the conversationalist, which, as you know, is very stark in contrast to Darcy, who basically remained quiet the entire visit. But after some time, Darcy asked Elizabeth about her family. Always the one to try and make someone squirm, she mentions that Jane has been in London for several months and asked if he'd bumped into her at all. She just wanted to see how he reacted. He looked a little confused by how to answer the question, as he told her that he had not been fortunate enough to see Miss Bennet in town. The two men excused themselves soon after, and they returned to their aunt's estate. Things start to get spicier the next time the Collins coalition is invited to dine at Lady Catherine's. It didn't come as quickly as they normally did. The narrator points out that it became obvious Lady Catherine only wanted their company on a regular basis when she had no one more interesting to visit her. But after dinner, Colonel Fitzwilliam has engaged Lizzie in a conversation that was twice as lively as she'd had in that room ever before. There was enough animation and laughter that it drew the attention of the other, more boring people. Lady Catherine demanded to know what they were talking about. Her nephew, the colonel, said that they were just talking about music, and the lady, almost exactly the same way Mr. Collins did at the ball, went on to say that she loves music. There are few in England who enjoy music more than herself, and that if she had ever learned, she would have been really good. She then reminds Elizabeth of the many conversations they've had where she's urged the young lady to practice more, and reminds Mrs. Collins that despite having no instrument in her home, she is welcome to come over and play any time, noting that there's a piano in the servants' quarters where she won't be in anyone's way. For a change, it was Mr. Darcy who was hiding his feelings of shame at how poorly behaved his family member was in a social setting. After coffee, Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Lizzie that she'd promised to play for him, and he pulls a chair up to the piano so he could sit next to her. After about half a song, Mr. Darcy stood up and walked over to the piano, positioning himself where he was face to face with Lizzie. Not to be intimidated, Lizzie joked with him, "You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all this state to hear me? I will not be alarmed. There is a stubbornness about me that can never bear to be frightened at the will of others." This is not the first time where she's told Darcy basically that if she consents someone wants her to do something, she is bound to do the opposite. He says he knows better than to think that he could alarm her, and that he's known her long enough to know how her mind works. She laughs with the Colonel, claiming that he should not listen to anything his cousin Darcy says about her, and she goes on to teasingly tell the man that she secretly hated that if he says anything too inflammatory, she will have to retaliate by sharing things that would shock his relations. He smiled at her, saying he is not afraid of her. Colonel Fitzwilliam's curiosity had been piqued, though, and he demanded examples of what dirt she had on his cousin. No, she's not about to open the Wickham can of worms here, but she mentions the first time they met at that ball in Hertfordshire, saying that he only danced a few times despite there being women sitting out every dance for lack of enough young men. Darcy defends himself, saying he didn't know anyone outside of his own party that night, and Lizzie sarcastically jabs that, oh yes, and of course nobody can be introduced in a ballroom. She turned her attention back to the Colonel, but something seemed to have stirred in Darcy, and he continued on the topic. Maybe I should have asked for an introduction, but I am not well equipped to make friends with strangers. Without taking her eyes off Darcy, Lizzie asked the Colonel why he thought this was the case about his cousin. That's easy, he said. He can't be troubled to make an effort towards meeting people. Darcy defends himself, claiming he doesn't have the talent that some people have for casually meeting new people. He admits part of that is that he has a hard time being interested in the concerns of a stranger, which he has noticed is an important skill in making new friends. Lizzie wiggles her fingers at him, saying that her fingers do not move over the piano as well as other ladies because she does not practice enough. But she accepts that it's her fault because she does not practice, and it's not because she's incapable of it. Darcy smiled a little, saying that she has made better use of her time than just trying to get good at piano to play in social settings. And then, in one of the greatest lines of subtext in the entire book, he said, "We neither of us perform to strangers." The Colonel changed topics, but Lizzie hung to that last comment from Darcy for the rest of the evening. Why, the more she talked with him, was it harder to hold on to the hatred she had sworn to feel for him? We then get a short but very curious chapter. One morning, Elizabeth was at the Collinses' house alone when there was a ring at the door. She'd heard no carriage, so she assumed it must be a villager, but when she opened it, Darcy was there. He apologized, realizing Lizzie was alone, saying he thought all the ladies would be in the house, but she invited him in and they proceeded to spend several minutes in awkward attempts to talk. They talk of Bingley, they talk of Mr. Collins's house, his choice in a wife. They argue over the idea of if Charlotte settling down 50 miles from her parents was close or not. Within a couple more minutes, he apologized for the intrusion and left. Elizabeth sat alone in the cottage, too stunned to process what had just happened. When she told Charlotte about it later, her friend said, "It must be because he's in love with you." But Lizzie can't conceive that possibility. No, why would he have been so silent if that was the case? She said it must have been because he was desperate for a reason to leave his aunt's house, but it was too cold for field sports. Mrs. Collins was quick to accept this explanation because it turns out she had been hoping that there might be something between Lizzie and Colonel Fitzwilliam. It's a quirky little chapter, right? Feels very out of left field. Now, in storytelling, there are several different terms you could use to describe a scene like this. One that comes out of nowhere, where a character behaves very strangely compared to what we already know about them. But they all share one idea, which is the purpose of a chapter like this is to hint that something is coming. Some event that is about to change the course of the story is on its way. It's almost like the author's equivalent of shaking us to make sure we're paying attention before the good part. And it's not the very next chapter where it happens, but this next chapter does set up the event even more. So, briefly, one day while out on a walk, she bumped into Colonel Fitzwilliam and they continued their walks together. Naturally, they talk about Darcy. The Colonel talks about his cousin the way anyone does about a relation that you have mixed feelings about. You try to give them your full endorsement while making the concessions necessary to show that you see they're not the most perfect person. Somehow, Bingley comes up and Lizzie talks about how she is amazed how two men so different can be such good friends, saying that it almost appears as if Darcy takes care of Bingley. The Colonel chuckles at that and says he supposes his cousin does take care of Mr. Bingley, and then he recalls a story he'd recently heard about something Darcy had done. Elizabeth's stomach sank as she listened. He described how Darcy had recently told him of a friend he'd helped out. The Colonel says his cousin hadn't named Bingley as the friend, but he's pretty sure that's who he was talking about. This friend had apparently been getting involved with a woman of a disadvantaged nature, but Darcy took some pride in having figured out how to save his friend from a most imprudent marriage. He only assumes it's Bingley because he's the one friend he can see being likely to fall in love with someone that was no good for him. Lizzie masked her anger and hatred, asking if he knew more details about why Darcy had run interference. He didn't have much more to share, just saying that he understood there were strong objections to the lady. She tried to get as much information out of the Colonel as she could without letting him piece together that it was her sister he was talking about. When she got home, she shut herself in her room and seethed at the thought of how the two men that could have made herself and her sister happy happened to be the exact two men that Mr. Darcy had so much influence over as to deprive the Bennet sisters of their happiness. But since she still says she was never in love with Wickham, she was more upset about Bingley and Jane. The line from the Colonel rang in her head over and over again. There were some strong objections against the lady. She wanted to scream. Her head was so full of angry static trying to process all of this. She knew that the objection could not have been against Jane herself. She was the purest, kindest, most beautiful person. He must have objected to her family and her status. He was such a proud man that, of course, he took issue with even his friend flirting beneath his rank. She eventually got a headache from how distressed this news made her. That, mixed with her wish to not have to see Mr. Darcy, led to her backing out of the dinner invitation to Lady Catherine's that night. Mr. Collins, of course, was nervous how Lady Catherine would take the news of her absence. All right, kids, buckle up. Take a deep breath, and don't say I didn't warn you. When the Collinses had left for Lady Catherine's, Lizzie tried to occupy herself with reading Jane's old letters. But as she reread them, she could see the veiled pain that her sister had written about regarding Bingley's disappearance from her life. And this sparked a new fire, knowing that Darcy had been boasting about saving his friend from an unsatisfying arrangement. As she fumed about this, the bell rang. She thought it must be the Colonel. He had visited in the evening before. Maybe he'd come to check on her, having heard that she'd been ill. But the footsteps that traced into the room belonged to no one other than Fitzwilliam Darcy. He fumbled over his words, asking her how she was. She answered him coldly. She was not trying to hide her displeasure. He sat down, but stood up almost immediately. He was nervous. But what for? They stayed in absolute silence for several minutes. Darcy was too nervous to speak, and Lizzie was too angry to let him off the hook. Until finally, he straightened his back and spoke directly to her. In vain I have struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Just imagine the dumbfounded expression on Lizzie's face. The person she hated most in the world had just told her he loved her? Where did that come from? Her face flushed. He kept talking. He'd gathered himself enough that he didn't sound as nervous as he shared how he'd fought the feelings for so long because of her situation, her class inferiority, the family obstacles between them, but the warmth he felt for her could not be overruled by reason. Lizzie listened, still shocked at what she was hearing. She already knew what her answer was going to be to him, but she still found herself feeling a little sympathy for the fact that he was putting himself out there and she was about to reject him hard. He continued describing the strength of his attachment for her, which he was powerless against. And as she listened to him speak of his anxieties and concerns for such an arrangement, she noticed that his face showed no insecurity. He was resolute in his feelings. With her response, she attempted to not be cruel, while not giving him any more hope than she tried to give Mr. Collins. I know I'm supposed to say I'm flattered and grateful when someone confesses feelings like this, even if I don't feel the same. And honestly, if I could feel grateful, I would thank you. But I can't. I'll never want your approval, and you've made it pretty clear you didn't offer it willingly anyway. I'm sorry if this hurts you. That was never my intention, and I hope the sting doesn't last long, based on what you just told me about how hard it was for you to admit you liked me, I have no doubt you'll get over it even faster. Darcy had been leaning against the fire mantle when she spoke, and she saw him go pale at her response. He was trying to hide his anger, maybe not anger at her, but definitely anger at himself for having exposed himself this way only to be rejected. Is this your complete response? May I ask why you make so little effort to be civil in your reply? Lizzie matched him in tone. And I may ask why, at the likelihood of offending me, you told me that you liked me against your better judgment? Was that alone not reason for some level of incivility in my response? But that's not the only reason. You know I have others. Even if your proposal had not ridiculed me in the process, do you think I could ever be tempted by the man who has been the means of ruining any chance at happiness for my sister? Darcy's face changed color again. This time it flushed pink. She spoke with such detail that he knew she did in fact know, but he didn't try to speak. He just listened. You can't even act like you were not the entire reason they were separated, even if it makes them both miserable? She paused. He still didn't speak, but he stood there so proudly she knew that he didn't feel any remorse for his actions. Can you even deny it? She challenged. He looked at her, squinting his eyes ever so slightly as he gathered himself. I have no reason to deny that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister. I would do anything for him. Lizzie audibly grunted in disgust. Then she lit into him again, saying it's not even just Jane that has her set against him. She then tells him about how Wickham has told her everything regarding the cruelty of Fitzwilliam Darcy. He did perk up at this. You seem pretty interested in the affairs of Mr. Wickham. How could anyone hear of his misfortunes and not feel concern for him? Ha! Darcy laughed. His misfortunes. Yes, his misfortunes have been great indeed. Lizzie's anger rose. The room was sizzling with contempt from both sides. You have made him practically a beggar because of your jealousy. You have robbed him of the best years of his life. You have done all this. Darcy took a sharp step towards her, so they were barely a foot apart. This is your opinion of me? He asked in low but very restrained tones. This is what you've been thinking of me all this time? No wonder you hate me. Based on these stories, my faults are very heavy. But maybe you've made a bigger deal about these stories because your pride was hurt when I told you my honest fears with acknowledging my feelings toward you. Maybe if I'd never mentioned them, you'd have looked past all this, but no. Dishonesty is the thing I hate most, and I will not be ashamed of the feelings I shared for you. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections? To congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beneath my own? Lizzie composed herself despite her anger reaching new levels. You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy. There is no possible way you could have proposed to me that would have ever tempted me to say yes. She took courage seeing how startled he was at this statement. From the very first moment we met, she said, you have been arrogant and conceited, and your disdain for the feelings of others has made me dislike you in a way I never thought I could dislike anybody. If months ago, before I learned about Jane or Wickham, someone had told me you were the last man on earth, I would still never have said yes to you. Darcy breathed in through his nose as he looked up at the ceiling, gathering himself, before he met Lizzie's eyes again and told her she has said quite enough. He perfectly understands her feelings now. He begs forgiveness for having taken up so much of her time and asks that she let him wish her health and happiness before storming out of the room. She heard the door shut loudly behind him. Lizzie was overcome. She sat down and angry cried for 30 minutes, unable to process what had just happened. To think he was so in love with her that he tried to overcome the exact same issues that had made him try to keep Jane and Bingley separate? Is he just smitten in love, or is he the world's largest hypocrite? She found herself a little flattered to have inspired such feelings in a man to cause such a display, but his stupid pride. Oh, how she hated it. She still didn't think she could ever forgive him for what he'd done to Jane. The fact that he admitted it and didn't even say he was sorry? How horrible of a man to do this. And poor Wickham, he didn't try to deny that either. She remained in this frantic mental state until she heard the carriage pull up outside, and she ran up to her room. Hot dang, what a chapter. But what makes this part of the book great is not just this emotional train wreck of an encounter, but the following chapters. I seriously think the 3-chapter run, starting off with the one we just covered, is the greatest 3-chapter stretch I've covered on the show so far regarding characters and learning about them and seeing them grow, you feel the anger of Lizzie, the hurt of Darcy, the pain of both of them. So let's move on to what happens next. The next morning, Lizzie went out for a walk, and she was terrified when she heard Darcy call her name. She froze. He approached her, but instead of trying to start a conversation, he handed her a letter and just asked that she would do him the honor of reading it all the way through. And then he left her alone. Lizzie waited until he was out of sight, and then she opened the letter. It began with him saying to not worry, he won't be repeating any of the sentiments that were so disgusting to her the previous night, but he felt he had to set the record straight on a couple things. He says he knows it may be hard for her to give him an unbiased ear, but she accused him of 2 different offenses that night, and he wanted to tell her his side of things. The first one, about meddling with Jane and Bingley, he regards as not as grievous as the second accusation, but he says he's seen Bingley have crushes a lot. But it wasn't until the Netherfield ball when he heard both Sir Lucas and her mother both say how they expected an engagement shortly. Suddenly, Darcy started paying very close attention to Jane. And he very quickly noticed how Bingley seemed to be in deeper than usual. But he watched Jane closely and eventually decided that she was not into Bingley genuinely. She didn't seem to have expressed the same level of feeling that Bingley did. He admits that if Lizzie says otherwise, she's obviously right. She knows her sister better than he does, but he was working with the information he had, and he felt like his best judgment was that Jane, by herself or by her mother, was attempting to enter into a relationship that she didn't want to be in just for the money. So he stepped in to protect his friend from ending up in what he believed to be a gold digger situation. He then clarifies that the same issues he had felt when he decided to propose to Lizzie weren't factored in to why he separated Bingley from Jane. If Bingley wanted to marry someone beneath him, he would not object as long as there were true feelings. He then goes into how Miss Bingley seemed pretty eager to help separate them, and so when they found out Jane had come to London, they made sure Bingley never found out, or he would have definitely gone to see her. He does make a point of saying that he still doesn't feel regret for what he did, considering it was the best information he had to work with, but he can understand that even this will upset Elizabeth to hear. He chose to be true to his friend, but he apologizes if he was responsible for hurting Jane's feelings and asks her to know it was not done with that purpose. But now we turn to the more interesting accusation, Mr. Wickham. He notes that no one outside his family has ever heard this story, but he trusts her to keep it a secret. He doesn't even try to address her actual accusation. He just says, "The only way for me to do this is to explain our entire history together." He points out in the letter that Lizzie never actually explained what Wickham had accused him of, but he can imagine. He then starts with the same facts that Wickham had said, how Wickham's father was a respectable man who worked for the late Mr. Darcy. He confirms his own father did love George Wickham, how he put him through school and provided for him since his own father was poor due to the extravagant spending of Wickham's mother. He said his father was such a fan of Wickham that he was blind to the ill-mannered nature of the young man. He had no sense of duty or responsibility, and when Darcy's father died 5 years ago, his will had stated he wanted Wickham to be offered the position of the church when it became vacant. All of this checks out with Lizzie up to now, but here is where things start to deviate. Darcy tells her that Wickham came to him saying he didn't want to become a clergyman and demanded £3,000 so he could go to law school. Darcy paid it, hoping that would be the last of their connection, but a few years later, after the money was gone and there was no law degree to be attained, he came back begging to be given the church position he'd been promised, which had already been filled in his absence. That was the last he had heard of Wickham for some time, until Darcy's younger sister got involved. His handwriting seemed to get more agitated in this section, where he talks about how he found out about a scheme just in time where Wickham had coordinated with Georgiana's governess to arrange for them to meet without Darcy knowing. And Wickham, who knew Georgiana had admired him, proposed they run away together. She agreed, and she was only 15. Darcy, by sheer luck, found out in time. He dismissed the governess, Wickham ran away before Darcy could confront him, and that was the last he had seen of him until they met in Meryton with the Bennet sisters. Now, I want to stop and have you reimagine that scene again with this context, because it's one thing to just be like, oh yeah, that makes sense now, but it's another to actually reimagine it from Darcy's point of view. You're out riding with your friend. You come across a group of sisters who you've come to know, and you may have started feeling things for one of them. And there you see the man who tried to elope with and disgrace your sister, who, when found out, ran away like a coward, and now you are seeing him again for the first time since all of that happened. I would have thrown a rock at him. He shares more details about how this affected his sweet sister, how she was to inherit 30,000 pounds, and he's convinced that was the only motivation for Wickham. The only other possible reason would be if he was dead set on getting revenge on Darcy, who Wickham, for his own purposes, saw as his enemy. He transitions to the close of the letter saying, "This, madam, is a faithful narrative of every event in which we have been concerned together. And if you do not absolutely reject it as false, you will, I hope, acquit me henceforth of cruelty towards Mr. Wickham." He promises her it is true, hopes that she can forgive him for his wrongs against her, but says if she can't believe him, just ask the Colonel. He can validate all of the stories about Wickham. And the letter ends saying, "God bless you, Fitzwilliam Darcy." Oh, man. I loved how Jane set us up for half the book having the worst assumptions about Darcy. And then in one chapter, we've completely gotten a different picture of who he is. He's still a proud man. Like, the whole stuff with Jane and Bingley is not completely understandable necessarily, but we at least see he's a man of honor who's acting according to his best beliefs. And the whole thing with Wickham just makes you go oh, I would not have guessed that was the case. But really quickly, I just want to point out, I didn't go into it as much as the letter does, but he does call out how the behavior of the entire family at the Netherfield ball was part of his concern about Bingley getting involved with Jane. And so I told you to pay attention to that chapter, and we lived it through Lizzie's eyes, her continually being more and more embarrassed by everything her family does. It's not to say you should be caught up in vanities of what everyone might be thinking about your family, but it's important to note, people do notice things, and you have to be able to live with the fact that people may be judging you for people that you hang out with. But back to the story. As you can imagine, Lizzie has no clue how to decide what she's feeling after reading this. And you, as the reader, probably also would be feeling similarly if you had come into this blind. We've spent the entire book seeing things from Lizzie's perspective, which, as pleasant and forgiving as it is in general, has always been set against Darcy. And even though we had the hints that he was into her, we could have had no guess that he was actually the saint in the situation between him and Wickham. We've been too well set up with Wickham's deceitful tales of having been wronged. He told them with just enough charm to be above suspicion. So we have just had the rug pulled out from under us as much as Lizzie did. She had read the first part about Jane with a feeling of contempt because his reasoning didn't convince her at all. But it was only after she read the part about Wickham, which was shocking to be sure. In fact, her gut reaction was to say this had to be a lie. The first time she read the letter, she just kind of shrugged it off, but she found herself coming back to it very soon and rereading it because there was something a little too true about his accusations of Wickham. And the fact that he dared her to ask the Colonel if she didn't believe him, she then remembered how Wickham had taken a fancy to Miss King the moment she came into 10,000 pounds. She reread the letter, studying every sentence, and she realized that nobody actually knew anything about Wickham before he'd shown up at Hertfordshire. Sure, he'd said things about his past, but there had been no one there to confirm if they were true. And then she started thinking about the first half of the letter again. Even though she still didn't like his answer, why would Darcy openly admit to doing something Lizzie found so offensive in the name of honor, only to lie about Wickham right after that? And slowly, the story started making her feel more and more like this entire letter was factual from his point of view. She even recalled how the one compliment Wickham had seemed to be able to pay Mr. Darcy was that he was devoted to his sister Georgiana. Everything just started making too much sense. And she begins to berate herself out loud. "How despicably I've acted," she said. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment, how humiliating is this discovery." To realize she has been fooled by a con man, and she has been blind this entire time to the nobility of another. She tells herself she has acted without reason. Quote, "Till this moment, I never knew myself." She now reread the first part of the letter and felt like she couldn't now believe the part about Wickham and still accuse him of having done anything more than what he believed to be best for his friend regarding Jane. She still didn't like it or excuse it, but she couldn't hate him for being cruel like she had been doing until now. She thought of what he'd said about her family behaving in a way that made him repel, and as much as she hated him judging her family, she remembered how she had felt so much shame on behalf of everybody else that night. So there was at least some truth to that as well. And for the third time in maybe 24 hours, she was so overcome with conflicting emotions that she felt wiped out. She had wandered the lane for hours, pondering everything before she came back to the Collins' home exhausted. And when she got there, she learned that while she was gone, both Darcy and the Colonel had called on the house looking for her, but neither of them were still around. She was glad. She still wasn't done thinking about this letter. What a run, huh? I loved how we got this explosive scene full of emotion. Then we got to hear the perspective of the person we've been judging. Then to finish it all off, we get to see our protagonist's reaction to the new information, including her ability to acknowledge where she had been wrong. Most stories don't give us such a neatly packaged set of scenes to explore scenarios like this so cleanly. And before we dive back in, this is as good a time as any to talk a little bit more about our author, Jane Austen, or a lady as she was called on the cover of her first novel to be printed, Sense and Sensibility. Because at that time, a woman author was not seen as a good thing necessarily. Writing should only be done by a woman as a hobby, you see. So many of the most popular female authors of this time published under male pseudonyms. Jane seemed to have a boldness about her that wanted to defy society while preserving her personal identity. So instead of her name, she was just a lady. And when Pride and Prejudice was published 2 years later, the author credit said, "From the author of Sense and Sensibility." She had been writing since she was 11. She wrote plays for her family to perform, and she came by her sarcasm early because she often liked to write things that poked fun at the types of stories where all the women did was cry and behave properly. We've already touched on how she had very strong views on issues of the time and used her stories to make subtle criticisms, but she wasn't just published as soon as she had written a final version of her novel. Her father sent a draft of Pride and Prejudice, originally titled First Impressions, to a publisher in 1797 when Jane was only 21 years old, but it was returned unopened. She never stopped writing, but she never had a book published until Sense and Sensibility in 1811. This book came out 2 years later, a full 16 years after it had been initially rejected by a publisher. She only saw 4 of her books published while alive. The rest were published by her family posthumously. She died at 41 of some illness that was never diagnosed in her lifetime. And she may have lived decades before Louisa May Alcott of Little Women fame, but they lived almost identical lives. They were both women who were so committed to their craft and their ideals of what life should be like for women in a time where they weren't given many options, that they themselves never married. Jane was proposed to once. She initially said yes, but took back her yes hours later. And while thinking on both these women, I can't help but notice how the same reason they are known and loved today as authors of some of the 19th century's greatest novels likely was tied to the fact that they remained single. Because my guess is that Jane Austen would have liked to have had a husband and maybe kids, who knows? But she lived at a time where it was really difficult to have it all. Now, some of you may snicker at me claiming that you can have it all today, but by comparison, yes, you can. You can have a family, you can have a career and hobbies if that's what you want. But back then, her pursuing her writing was probably working against her when it came to finding marriage prospects. Her first book wasn't published until she was 36. So during her 20s, when most women were trying to be married back then, she was obsessed with a craft that hadn't even acknowledged her presence yet. And even if she'd been published, sure, there may have been some fame chasers who would have liked to have been tied to a popular writer, but I still think there probably were a lot of men who would have been turned off by the woman who was trying to do a thing only men were supposed to do at that time professionally. But to prioritize finding someone to marry would mean sacrificing her dream and, honestly, her talent. To put the writing in a drawer and say, that was a silly idea, would have deprived the world of the books we universally appreciate today. And I don't point this out to say family doesn't matter, prioritize your personal goals. You know that I think what matters most is everyone being in touch with what you decide is most important to you and going after that. But I felt like it was important to highlight this because both Jane and Louisa May are examples of someone who had a choice to make. And they made the choice that felt right to them. And on the one hand, it has made their names be remembered for hundreds of years. And on the other hand, during their lifetime, they likely suffered all sorts of rumors and concerned family members and all the other social complications that come from not being normal. All for the sake of writing books that eventually were published, but never even made her a rich woman in her lifetime. You have the choice to focus your life in whichever direction feels right to you. But you need to understand, there are consequences to your choices. So make sure you pick the one you will regret the least. There is a lot more to be said about Jane Austen, but we'll definitely be covering more of her books on the show in the future, so there's no need to cover everything right now. Back to the story. Lizzie ended her trip short because she didn't want to be away from home any longer. Charlotte was bummed to see her go, and Lady Catherine was almost offended that someone would choose to leave her hospitality early, but Lizzie is undeterred. She went home by way of London again so she could visit Jane, and was relieved when Jane decided it was time for her to go home as well. She was glad to talk to her closest confidant again. But she didn't mention the proposal. She was afraid if she started talking about it, she would end up describing the situation with Bingley, which would only hurt her sweet Jane again. Her father sent the carriage to London to pick them up, and Kitty and Lydia came with it for a day in town before heading back. Lydia shares the sad news that the soldiers are all leaving Meryton soon to spend the summer stationed in Brighton. She is so bored at the idea of a summer without any soldiers, but she is happy to share the good news that Mr. Wickham is no longer attached to Miss King. She went to stay with her uncle, and he did not follow. They made their way home to Longbourn, where her father privately told her he was so happy to have her back. And having had enough time to think it through in her head, Lizzie finally was ready to tell Jane about Darcy. She'd rehearsed it enough that she could tell the story without mentioning Bingley, and was eager to get her sister alone. Jane was shocked to hear of the proposal, but her younger sister hadn't even told her about the letter yet. Again, just the part about Wickham, so she could spare Jane the pain of knowing what had driven Bingley away. And when she heard about the letter, Jane's shock turned to disbelief. Quote, "What a stroke was this for poor Jane, who would willingly have gone through the world without believing there was so much wickedness existed in the whole race of mankind as was here collected in one individual." But she found herself trying to justify both men being in the right and in the wrong, saying there must be some mistake. Lizzie laughs and says, "You will never be able to make both of them good for anything. Pick one. And as of late, I am inclined to believe it is Darcy. But choose for yourself." She also comments on how unfortunate it is for both men that while one has all the actual goodness between the two of them, the other has all the appearance of goodness. Jane then asks if she plans on doing anything about Wickham. But Lizzie says the public opinion of Darcy and Wickham is so set that she feels it would be too monumental of a task to try and change that. Wickham would be leaving in less than 2 weeks' time, so just let him fade away from everyone's collective memory. It was only after this long talk with her sister that Lizzie's mind finally felt aligned for the first time since those last few days at Rosings Park. Her first real conversation with her mother after returning home did not disappoint either. Mrs. B ranted about how Mr. Bingley had used her daughter extremely ill and how it would serve him right if Jane died of a broken heart so he would feel sorry for what he had done. She also takes very passive-aggressive shots at Mrs. Collins, saying that if Charlotte is half as sharp as her mother, she's definitely saving enough money because it's not like they're spending it on great housekeeping. But with her father reading his books, her mother complaining about how nobody cares for her nerves, her sisters filling the house with sounds, this was maybe the closest things would ever get back to what she considered normal just a year ago. We then learned that the wife of Colonel Forster, who is one of the officers of the regiment moving from Meryton to Brighton, has invited Lydia to come spend the summer with her. But just Lydia. Mrs. B is not only supportive, but envious. She recalls when she was young and in love with an officer, but he had gone away one day with his regiment, leaving her heartbroken. So it's almost wish fulfillment for her to see her daughter chase after officers. Mr. B is not excited about it, but when Lizzie protests, saying Lydia will make a fool of herself without anyone in the family there to watch over her, and that she will definitely bring shame to the family, her father admits his actual feelings, which show that as cool of a dad as he seems to be, he is also prone to lazy parenting. Quote, "Lydia will never be easy until she has exposed herself in some public place or other, and we can never expect her to do it with so little expense or inconvenience to her family as under the present circumstances." Basically saying, let her be someone else's problem for a while. Lizzie storms off. Ever since the letter from Darcy, she seems slightly more critical of her family's lack of self-awareness and propriety. Kitty, who is actually 2 years older than Lydia, is beside herself that Lydia is going and she is not. The joy felt by Lydia was matched by the anguish of Kitty. While Lydia had visions of being the center of attention of dozens of officers at social gatherings in Brighton, free of all of her sisters who might steal the limelight, Lizzie had visions of a selfish, vain, and ignorant girl making an absolute fool of herself. But she couldn't do anything about it. On the regiment's last night in Meryton, there was a gathering that the Bennets attended, and Lizzie was finding herself having to speak to Mr. Wickham. And now, the same veiled disdain that she had used so cleverly in past conversation with Darcy was being employed so she could get through this conversation with Wickham. She talked of spending a lot of time with Darcy at Rosings Park, and made sure to drop just enough hints to make the scoundrel realize she may know the truth about him now, leaving him to fumble his way through the rest of their talking until he could get away from the burning sensation of being found out. It was only a couple of weeks before Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, remember, the cool young aunt, came to Longbourn for a night so they could pick up Lizzie for a holiday they had planned with her months ago. They were going to the place where Mrs. Gardner had grown up. Lizzie was relieved to have a reason to forget all about the drama of her family, but as they traveled, the stress came flooding back in her when her aunt brought up how close she had grown up to Mr. Darcy's estate, Pemberley, and suggests they tour the grounds on their way to their destination. Lizzie is just as terrified of running into Darcy at Pemberley as she is about the idea of having to explain everything to her aunt, even if she is the cool aunt. So she tries to just say she's tired of seeing great houses. How many fine carpets or satin curtains can you really appreciate? But her aunt insists the house is not why you go to Pemberley, it's for the grounds. They are massive and immaculately kept, so somewhat against her will, she found herself on the way to visit Pemberley, where she might have been mistress of one of the finest estates in England with one simple yes. Lizzie's heart raced as they entered the woods of Pemberley Estate. Because, don't think of grounds as just a really big front and backyard. We're talking about dozens, if not hundreds of acres of land that probably involves some curated gardens and yard area, but also just a lot of wilderness. And when she first caught sight of the stone mansion, she was breathless, but she was still terrified they would show up and Darcy would be home. She was greatly relieved when the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, said he was not at home, but was expected to arrive the next day with a group of friends. Mrs. Reynolds happily gave them a tour of the estate. She was constantly praising her master as being the kindest, most intelligent man. Lizzie's aunt whispered about how, this sure doesn't match up with what we know about him, does it, Lizzie? But Lizzie, knowing far more than Mrs. Gardner at this point, chuckled nervously in response. At one point, she found herself distanced from the rest of the group, staring at a large portrait of Darcy from when he was about 20, so like 8 years ago. He had a smile on his face that she had only ever seen in real life when he was looking at her. She stared into his painted eyes as she thought about all the things Mrs. Reynolds had said about how he never said an unkind word to her, how he was going to be just as generous a man as his father had been. Obviously, just because a servant said it didn't make it true, but she believed that servants of all people were the most likely to be critical of their employers if they had any reason to be. So the fact that Mrs. Reynolds had absolutely nothing bad to say about him made her think that, for the most part, he must be just as kind and providing as she claimed him to be. She felt her heart soften even more towards him, or maybe think of it like the Grinch's heart growing 3 times. These thoughts and more weighed on her heart as they left the mansion and began to walk the grounds, heading for the river that ran through them. Her uncle had been looking back to the house, taking his best guess about what year it had been built, when they saw the owner of it walking towards them. He was coming from the stables, as if he had just arrived home. They were already too close to not run into each other. And when Lizzie found the strength to look into his eyes, both of their cheeks blushed with the uncertainty of how to handle this moment. He seemed stunned that she was at his home, as he probably should have been, and she was distraught that her worst fears had come true about visiting this place. But he didn't act like anything was out of the ordinary. That's the beauty of being trained how to act in social situations from birth. You're good at masking your feelings. They shared a few very awkward minutes talking about anything besides the thoughts in their heads. And after talking but not saying anything real, he excused himself. Her aunt and uncle, who had stepped away as soon as they could tell there was something going on between the two of them, came back and started gossiping about what a strange interaction they had seen. They continued their walk, and Lizzie felt embarrassed over how she'd handled the meeting. But more so, she hated what him catching her at his house could be interpreted as. Would he think that she was now trying to throw herself at him? What bad luck that they hadn't come through just 10 minutes earlier. They wandered the grounds until her aunt was feeling tired and needed to sit down. But they stopped so her uncle could admire the stock of fish in Darcy's ponds, and they saw that the homeowner was back on the grounds marching out towards them. Lizzie braced herself for round 2 of what she thought would be the most awkward day of her life. She was more composed this time, quick to remark on how beautiful the grounds were. She was so complimentary until she had the thought of, what if he takes all this flattery to be me sucking up to him, and she shut her mouth. She realized that she hadn't introduced her aunt and uncle, and the Gardners were her most respectable relations. He was a London lawyer after all, but they still weren't of the same elite class as Mr. Darcy by any means. But Darcy seemed pleased to meet them and quickly started talking to Mr. Gardner about the fish. And Darcy even invited her uncle to fish there as often as he liked while they were in town, even going as far as to say he could borrow a rod or any supplies he needed, pointing the best parts of the stream out to get a good catch. Lizzie walked arm in arm with her aunt as they left the 2 men to talk about fish, but Lizzie kept stealing glances over her shoulder. She was perplexed. Why was he being so nice to people that he had previously been known to not care about? It couldn't be for her, could it? The last interaction they'd had in person was her screaming at him about what a monster he was for ruining her sister's happiness. That couldn't be what brought about this change, right? When Mrs. Gardner said she needed to sit down for a bit, Darcy replaced her on Lizzie's arm, and the 2 of them continued walking. Once they were alone, Lizzie profusely apologized for the intrusion, saying she'd only come because her aunt wanted to see the grounds, but she mentioned how the housekeeper had claimed he wouldn't be there until the next day. He nodded his head and said he'd come back early to take care of some matters with his steward before the guests arrive. He mentions that Bingley and his sister will be among them. Lizzie tensed up. It felt weird to pretend that Bingley was just a mutual friend rather than the heart of their biggest argument in the past. But before she could come up with something to say that wouldn't deflate them both, he added that there was someone else coming, his sister, and he asks for the privilege of introducing her to Lizzie while they are in the area. She said yes, slightly stunned, and they walked in silence for a while before leading her back to the carriage where they left for their lodgings. Her aunt and uncle quickly began talking about how he was nothing like he'd been portrayed to them to be. He was kind, easy to talk to, and generous in his offers to host them whenever. They called back to their confusion about how could a man like this supposedly be so cruel to Mr. Wickham, and Lizzie, biting her nail, just said that maybe they had been deceived about his character. And as they talked, the carriage rolled on, away from the great house of Mr. Darcy. They were staying at an inn a handful of miles away from the estate, and it was the very next morning when a carriage pulled up and 3 people climbed out. There was Darcy, there was a beautiful young woman who had to be his sister Georgiana, and last out of the carriage was that smiling man, Mr. Bingley. She hadn't seen him since his ball months and months ago, and he seemed to be the exact same guy. She found it hard to resent him at all regarding Jane. After all, he had been told that she wasn't interested in him by people that he trusted. She observed his interactions with Georgiana, who Miss Bingley had tried to paint as a rival for Jane's affections in her letters, and was relieved to see that they treated each other more like siblings than anything else. When Bingley greeted her, he said it had been a very long time since he'd had the pleasure of seeing her, then goes on to state the exact date of the ball, November 26th. This was a promising sign. What reason would a man have for recalling a date so crisply if it wasn't for some event on par with it being the last time you saw somebody you loved? Mr. Darcy seemed more at ease, but also eager, the way you are when you show your close friend your favorite movie or another part of your identity that you really want them to approve of. Miss Georgiana was a delight. She was well-mannered, but still carried a lot of youthful excitement. She was so delighted to get to know Lizzie, and Lizzie, in turn, could see very quickly why her older brother loved her so much and had such a protective nature for her. She was pure and sweet, and someone as greedy as Wickham would have ruined her. The visit was pleasant, and as they prepared to leave, Georgiana, in an almost rehearsed way, as if she'd been asked by her brother to do it, invited the 3 of them to dine at Pemberley. They agreed, and after the visitors were gone, Lizzie sat in her room marveling at how un-Darcy-like this whole event had been. For the man who she would have described in a single word being proud to bring his fancy friends to an inn so he could introduce his sister to a lower-class acquaintance and her aunt and uncle, and then invite them to dinner, did not feel like a very proud thing to do. And when they arrived at Pemberley for dinner, Georgiana was playing hostess. It was clear that she was pretty uncomfortable with such social responsibilities, but she was making an honest effort. and that made Lizzie love her even more. The evening was lovely, except for the attempts of Miss Bingley to drag Lizzie down in front of Darcy, because if she'd suspected Darcy liked Lizzie before, she was convinced of it now and was going to do everything in her power to make sure it didn't happen again. With comments like, "Didn't the militia leave Meryton recently? That must be a great loss for your family." Lizzie felt embarrassment for Georgiana and Darcy to have Wickham alluded to in their presence. Miss Bingley could have no idea that by saying this, she was actually lessening her chances of making Darcy like her. But when Lizzie and the Gardiners left, Miss Bingley tried to turn Georgiana against Lizzie with criticisms about Lizzie's manners, but Georgiana would not be convinced. She liked Miss Bennet. And when the jealous pick-me girl tried to tell Darcy how ill Lizzie looked that night, he refused to acknowledge her statements. She throws one last Hail Mary, and she recalls when they'd first come to Netherfield and how they'd been told about the famed beauty of the Bennet sisters, to only show up at that first ball, and how disappointed they'd all been. Darcy, barely willing to engage with the jealous woman, said, "Yes, but that was only when I first saw her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women I've ever met." Now, let's talk about handsome for just a second, because it gets used a lot, and it's more than just physical looks. It includes things like behavior, posture, your humor. It's basically everything about how you present yourself in public. Soon after this, Lizzie got 2 letters delivered to her from Jane. One had been written 5 days ago, but had been sent to the wrong place originally due to how poorly Jane had written the address on it. And the second one was very recently sent. She decided to read them in order, and the first letter painted a picture of Jane feeling frantic, but still trying to appear optimistic, claiming that things would turn out okay. But the news was a gut punch. The family had received news from Colonel Forster, the husband of Lydia's friend and hostess in Brighton, saying that the youngest Miss Bennet had run off with Mr. Wickham. Jane says she is willing to hope for the best in the idea that Wickham's character has been misunderstood, but these events don't seem to promise much for his goodness. Lydia had left a note for Mrs. Forster, but that was all the information they had. Mrs. B is completely beside herself. Jane apologizes for how unreadable the letter may be, but she knows Lizzie will understand, given the circumstances. So Lizzie ripped open the second letter, written several days after the first. This one said the fears were now less about Lydia running off to marry Wickham, but if Lydia had run off with Wickham without the intent to get married. Lydia's note had said they were going to Scotland, but Mr. Denny, the soldier who had introduced the Bennets to Wickham in the first place, said he had reason to believe they weren't actually going to Scotland at all. Everyone thinks Wickham's intentions are more wicked than previously thought. Jane says she's still holding out hope that not even he could be so selfish to ruin a sweet girl like Lydia and her family's reputation in the process. Mr. Bennet is a wreck, which is so different from his normal attitude. He had been the rock to weather all the emotions of the 6 women in his family, so to see him unsettled was disturbing to everyone. She says Mr. Bennet is heading to London to search for them, and this letter was sent to ask Mr. Gardiner to join their father and Colonel Forster in hunting for the runaways. Lizzie was a wreck by the time she finished the letter and immediately began looking for her uncle, but before she found him, she bumped into Darcy, who had come to visit her. Seeing her emotion, Darcy asked what was wrong, but when he sees how upset Lizzie is, and he hears her saying how she needs to find her uncle, he immediately orders a servant to go find Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, and then he asks Lizzie to sit. She didn't have it in her power to tell him no. For a few minutes, they sat in silence as she cried, and Darcy tried to be of comfort without intruding on her private matters, but eventually, she opened up to him about Lydia and Wickham. And it turns out Lizzie was blaming herself. If she had only warned everybody of the type of person that Wickham was once she'd learned the truth, this would never have happened. Darcy didn't try to tell her it's okay. He didn't try to tell her she shouldn't feel that. He was pacing the room in thought. Lizzie briefly considered how if there was any chance of him still being interested in her, it would definitely have been killed off by this. Her sister disgracing the family with the very man he hated the most. But that didn't last long because she was focused on her family. After a few more minutes of silence, Darcy apologized, saying he realized she probably would prefer being alone to having someone like him invading her space at a time like this, and that his only real reason for staying was genuine concern for her welfare. But he says he will leave her now, and that he will convey to Georgiana that something has come up and Elizabeth will not be able to visit them. She thanks him for his consideration and his willingness to cover up the truth from potentially judgmental ears. After he left, Lizzie couldn't fight the thought of how she found herself even more drawn to Darcy after this display. His kindness, but his awareness, was unlike anything she'd experienced in a man. When her aunt and uncle returned, Mr. Gardner immediately prepared to meet Mr. Bennet in London, and his wife helped Lizzie prepare for her return home. And for an entire chapter, it's basically just showing how agitated the women are at home. They are desperate every morning for the mail to get delivered, hoping for updates from father about if they found Lydia. Mrs. B was her usual flavor of genuine concern for her daughter mixed with pulling the attention back on her and how much she is suffering, blaming everyone but herself, who, remember, she was the one who desperately wanted Lydia to be able to go. She is so anxiety-ridden about everything. And then, in almost the same breath, she expresses concern for the mistakes Lydia has made, and also says how she's concerned Mr. Bennet will likely die trying to fight Wickham, and they will all be kicked out of Longbourn by Mr. Collins. They are pretty unhappy to learn that Kitty had been aware of this being in the process. She had been Lydia's confidant. Unfortunately, she didn't have any more details about where they had ended up. Jane was still hoping for the best, but her hope was fading fast into the same pessimism that everyone else had about the character of Mr. Wickham. Mrs. Forster had forwarded the note that Lydia had left her. The girl's empty head was apparent on the page. She talks about how excited it makes her to think of writing her family to tell them that she is now Mrs. Lydia Wickham, and asks Mrs. Forster to have the servant sew the slit in her muslin gown while she's away. She'll send for her clothes when she returns to Longbourn as the only married sister. Lizzie is incensed at the complete thoughtlessness of her baby sister. Day after day passes with no encouraging news from London. One day, a letter came from Mr. Collins, and they opened it because Mr. Bennet had said to open anything that came addressed to him while he was away. The letter, in a way that was so tone-deaf that only Mr. Collins could have written it, expressed his condolences to the Sir about the disgrace that has come to his family, and shares the advice that supposedly the great Lady Catherine had given him, that the only option was to cut ties with her completely, because if not, who would connect themselves with such a family? He wrote that with the handwritten equivalent of a straight face. No sympathy, no understanding of how he was piling on pain to an open wound, but just the cold belief that he was sharing practical advice. Papa Bennet finally returned home, not having succeeded in finding his daughter, but Mr. Gardner was still on the case. He knew London better and had connections that could help him. Mr. Bennet was tired. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. He was feeling miserable, but he was saying that he deserves this suffering. It's his fault this happened, so why shouldn't he feel the pain? He then tells Kitty that she will never leave the house until she's proven that she can behave herself around men. Kitty, not understanding the sarcasm in her father's comment, began to cry. 2 days after their father had returned, they finally got a letter from their uncle. He had found them. They were not yet married, and when he found them, it didn't appear there was any intention on Wickham's part to make that happen. But he engaged in a negotiation, and he thinks he's arrived at an agreement that he's so sure Mr. Bennet will be okay with that he's already committed him to it. For the fee of £100 a year, and Lydia's equal share to the family inheritance once both parents are gone, Wickham agreed to do the right thing, and in so doing preserve the honor of the Bennet name. Lizzie and Jane are so elated that the agreement is so manageable, maybe Wickham isn't as hard up as they'd thought. But Mr. Bennet is more shrewd and is certain that his brother-in-law must have paid a much bigger amount of money up front just to get Wickham to agree to so little. He doesn't know how he will ever repay him. When Jane is too innocent to understand this, her father says no man in his senses should marry Lydia for so little as $100 a year. They had also been hearing stories of all the debts Wickham had accumulated with every store owner and merchant in Meryton during his time here. This man did not know how to live on a meager amount. Wickham is a fool if he marries Lydia for less than £10,000, he said. The family began preparations to receive the married couple in a few days' time. Mrs. Bennet flipped completely from self-pity and self-righteous anger to overflowing with joy that she finally had a married daughter. Mr. Bennet debated if he ever wanted to see Lydia again. He got into a fight with his wife when he told her that he didn't ever want to welcome them into Longbourn and that they needed to learn their choices had consequences. You can imagine how that went over with Mrs. B. But with this news killing off the worst of their fears, Lizzie, for the first time in days, found time to think of herself. And her thoughts were turned to Darcy. How she kind of regretted telling him about Lydia, but she also trusted him to keep it to herself. She thought of how ironic it was that she had had such a reversal of her opinion of him over the last 4 months, which is the time since the proposal, that she envied that younger version of herself for the chance that she had to be married to such a man. She realized that he was the exact type of man she needed. They complemented each other. They both would have benefited from a union like that. But that was all gone because she lacked the information to understand his character until it was too late. Once Mr. Bennet had been forced to be okay with them coming to Longbourn, Mr. Gardner arranged for the newlyweds. Yes, he oversaw their immediate union to put a stop to any possible rumors, but he then arranged for the newlyweds to return to Lydia's home so they could all celebrate together. And after this, we get the return of Lydia. In short, she acts like nothing she did was amiss, like she was just living the greatest love story ever told. Wickham kind of acts like a dog with his tail between his legs because he's aware enough to know that nobody there except maybe his mother-in-law actually likes him. Lydia is so shameless that when it comes time to eat, she takes great pride in pointing out to Jane that since she is now married, she actually gets to sit at Jane's old space. I don't know exactly what the decorum is, but that time was weird enough that it doesn't surprise me there would have been something like this. And Lydia just keeps going, talking as if she is now some wise and experienced woman, which she literally ran away 2 or 3 weeks before this, by the way. And she talks of how she longs to see all her sisters married like she is. Later in that evening, she's retelling the events of her wedding privately to Lizzie and Jane, which was more of a shotgun wedding than anything, but she talked about it like it was from a fairy tale. But things got interesting when she let slip that Darcy had been at the wedding. "Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth gasped. "Oops," Lydia said. "I wasn't supposed to tell anyone, but he came with Wickham. Isn't that nice? But I'm not supposed to tell a soul." Jane and Lizzie share a glance and then promise to not tell anyone. But Lizzie immediately sent a letter to her cool aunt, Mrs. Gardner, demanding to share any details she knows about the situation. Mrs. Gardner does not disappoint. Her lengthy reply letter to Lizzie says that one day, Mr. Darcy showed up at their home and spent several hours locked in the study with Mr. Gardner. She later learned that he had come to say that he had figured out where the couple was hiding and had spoken to them. When he was asked how come he felt such an obligation to help someone like Lydia, his reasoning had been that he felt responsible for not having exposed Wickham for the man he was, and that now he felt he must make sure that this man did no more damage to anyone else's reputation. He had spent days in London hunting them down before he located them, but he had dedicated himself entirely to it. When he found them, he first tried to get Lydia to just leave with him, but she was convinced that she was in love and that they were to be married soon, and refused to leave her beloved Wickham. So that is when Darcy turned to getting Wickham to agree to marry Lydia. He quickly learned that the man had never intended to marry her, trying to paint the picture that she had made the mistake of following him even though he'd never made such promises to her. Whether any of this was true or not didn't matter to Darcy. The story that led them there didn't matter as much as resolving the situation Lydia now found herself in. In short, what went down was this. Darcy had to promise to pay off all of Wickham's debts, plus some undisclosed amount as a large payment before he even would agree to accept the terms of $100 a year that Mr. Bennet had been asked to pay him. But even more curiously, he had demanded that Mr. Gardner take credit for brokering the deal. He did not want to be named in the matter. He had done all of this while his sister and friends were at Pemberley. So he rejoined them once the matter was agreed upon, but he came back to make sure the wedding actually took place. He even stayed long enough to dine with the Gardners the next day before leaving town again. Mrs. Gardner begs Lizzie's forgiveness for saying she has to mention how much she likes the man. She has been so pleasantly surprised by what he turned out to be, hinting that she didn't get to tour his grounds in their entirety, and she hopes to have a connection that would allow for her to do that someday. It's amazing how, good or bad, the actions of Fitzwilliam Darcy have an ability to make Elizabeth Bennet not know how to feel. Because after reading this, she is constantly feeling overwhelmed whenever she learns something new about him, and this letter was no exception. She couldn't be sure of his motive either. Sure, maybe he had flashes of his own sister and he just really hated Wickham enough to not want to see him get away with disgracing anyone. But what if he had done this for a woman who he, at least at one time, had loved, despite being ridiculed for expressing that love? As much as this made her think that maybe he did still have feelings for her, she also realized that now that Wickham was actually her brother-in-law, there was no way he would want to tie himself to her family. And fellas, I just want you to pay attention to what happened here, and maybe it will make you see why women don't like it when you try to solve their problems. It's because the classic trope of women just wanting someone to listen is actually just frustration that you are trying to just tell them what they should do to fix it, instead of just going out and fixing it without burdening her with any effort. Darcy set an impossibly high standard for men today. He spent a lot of money, used all his connections, and sacrificed days of his life to solve her biggest problem for her without even telling her what he was doing. When she first read the letter to him about Lydia running away, he didn't just sit next to her and suggest where they could go look for her or how to emotionally move on from this. That would be giving Lizzie work to do. Nobody wants someone else to tell them what they should be doing to make their lives better. Darcy just excused himself from the room and went to work behind the scenes. Now, obviously, I'm being kind of sarcastic. Although I do think this is a real thing for men and women alike, I don't want someone coming at me in a couple weeks when they say their girlfriend broke up with them because he went to her work and chewed out her boss for her. But I do think there's something to be said about the idea of, if you tell me what I have to do to solve my problems, it feels like lecturing. It feels like you're adding to my workload, which I'm already overwhelmed by. But if you just listen in silence and then come back later and tell me that you fixed it for me, how am I not going to appreciate you? So, to men and women alike, maybe think of how you can tactfully find ways to remove burdens from your loved ones yourself, instead of just sharing your opinion of what they should do to fix their problems that have already emotionally zapped them. After a few days, the supposedly happy couple had to leave for Wickham to rejoin his regiment. Lydia had never stopped being annoying about how elegant she was now that she was married the entire time. So, other than Mrs. B and maybe Kitty a little, nobody was sad to see them go. But it wasn't long until a rumor started circulating the Shire. Netherfield's housekeeper had been warned to get the place in order for the arrival of Mr. Bingley. Lizzie saw the shock on Jane's face when they heard the news, but she was quick to hide it. Later, Jane swears that she is quite over him, but Lizzie remembers how keen Bingley had seemed when she'd met up with him at Pemberley, and she was convinced it would only take having the two of them in a room together for a few minutes for everything to spark all over again. Jane's anxiety about seeing him manifests itself in her claiming that she doesn't even want to see him. But she doesn't get much say in the matter because one day, without warning, he shows up at the house, and Darcy was with him. Mrs. Bennet soured at hearing this unwelcome addition, but now Lizzie was in the exact same scenario as Jane. The man she felt things for, but had claimed publicly that she didn't, was now at her door. The fact that he'd come to Netherfield and joined Bingley to visit their home surprised her just as much as his altered behavior had when he'd brought Georgiana to meet her. He has to still feel something, she thought, but what if she was wrong? Imagine the romantic tension in that room. Bingley and Jane trying to gauge feelings, Darcy and Lizzie trying to gauge feelings, and in the middle of it all is Mrs. Bennet with no idea how much complexity has developed between these four people over the past year. They chatted politely with awkward pauses that proved that all four of them were just as nervous about this interaction as the others. Mrs. Bennet was filling Bingley in, because she didn't care about Darcy, but she was filling Bingley in on Charlotte's marriage to Mr. Collins, Lydia's to Wickham, as if she was his only source of information in the Hertfordshire region. He graciously engaged in conversation with her while shooting glances over at Jane. Jane stared at the floor, mostly, her cheeks flushed. Mrs. B kept talking about her new son-in-law and how hard of a life he'd had. Lizzie cringed, knowing that Darcy had to listen to this ignorance, knowing that the man her mother openly disliked was the reason her daughter hadn't been completely disgraced and the family brought to ruins. This hurt more than anything. And finally, the conversation changed to Mr. Bingley's stay. He'd come for a few weeks to do some hunting. The only relief Lizzie got from the scene was seeing how Jane blossomed after some time in Bingley's presence. She was warm, she smiled, and she seemed to finally admit to herself that she did still feel for him. And his warm smiles in return encouraged her. This gave Lizzie some level of happiness, in spite of her own personal hell, not sure what was going on with Darcy. Eventually, the two men got up to leave. Mrs. B hints strongly that she wants to host him for that dinner that she never got the chance to last year before he'd run off. Bingley smiled, mumbled something of an apology for the suddenness of his departure, and the two men left Longbourn. But Bingley and Darcy start hanging around more often. Mrs. Bennet does host a dinner where both men come. Jane keeps trying to tell Lizzie that she's not in love with Bingley anymore, but, yeah, right, we all know. In short, Bingley was forward enough with Jane that Mama B is now convinced things are back on track. And Lizzie spent most of the time that night of the dinner frustrated that she didn't get to talk to Darcy much at all. Other people kept getting in the way of them having any moments together. She tried to tell herself there was no way he was still interested, but at the same time, she had to know. A few days later, Bingley pays another visit, and this time 5-star General Mrs. Bennet is on her A-game again, and she manages to find a way of leaving Jane alone with Bingley, but she's not super clever about it. She started by trying to wink at her other daughters, hinting at them to find a reason to excuse themselves. But Kitty, unfortunately, was too thick to catch on until she spoke out loud asking her mother why she kept winking at her. But Mrs. B got impatient and made up a reason for why Kitty needed to leave the room with her, leaving just Lizzie and the lovebirds. But within about a minute, Mama B called for Lizzie, saying she needed to speak with her about something. But unlike every adaptation I've seen of this story, he doesn't actually propose here. He seems to be a skittery fellow, and despite having time alone that day, it takes another reason to visit another day until he finally pops the question. Jane was going to be a Bingley. Lizzie could only smile with relief that the matter that had caused her so much vexation and even pain over the past year had finally resolved so happily. The only other note I'll make of the family's happy reaction is the line that says, "Wickham and Lydia were all forgotten. Jane was beyond competition for her favorite child." At the moment, she, meaning Mama Bennet, cared for no other. That night in Jane's room, she and Lizzie shared secret details as they always had since they were little girls. Jane tells her how Bingley had spoken of his love for her when he'd left last November, but that he'd thought her indifferent. Lizzie just smiles through it, telling her sister now the full truth wouldn't do any good. Bingley had truly loved her all along, and that was what mattered. This chapter ends with a sharp commentary on how fast these social graces can swing back and forth. Quote, "The Bennets were speedily pronounced to be the luckiest family in the world, though only a few weeks before, when Lydia had first run away, they had been generally proved to be marked out for misfortune." Days later, when the general merriment of Jane's engagement had worn off, the family was thrown for a loop when a fancy carriage rolled up to their door. It was Lady Catherine de Bourgh? But why? After a few moments inside with the family, the lady made it clear her goal in coming was to talk to Lizzie and ask to go out for a walk alone. When they were outside, the old know-it-all said, "Miss Bennet clearly must know why she has come." Lizzie says no, that she genuinely has no clue, and Lady Catherine treats that as a hostility. But after a scoff, she begins explaining that 2 days ago, a report reached her that Elizabeth Bennet was likely to become engaged to her nephew, Mr. Darcy. "I know it must be a scandalous falsehood, but I had to settle this for myself, so I came immediately." "If you really believe it impossible, why did you take the trouble of coming all this way yourself?" "So I could hear you deny it in person," she said. Lizzie was matching Lady Catherine wit for wit and didn't feel like backing down to someone just because she was born to a more favorable circumstance. "I would think you coming all the way here would only confirm you believe it might be true." They exchange several more sharp jabs at each other. Lady Catherine launches into a story of how it was Darcy's mother's dying wish that their children should marry. "He is betrothed to my daughter." "Well," Elizabeth said snarkily, "then it sounds like you have nothing to worry about." Lady Catherine was getting pretty heated, telling her that if by some chance he did propose, she was to say no. Out of curiosity, Elizabeth asked why, if she was his choice, she was supposed to say no to him. "Because of honor, decorum, prudence," the lady squawked. "You will be censured and despised. Your name will never be mentioned by any of us." What it boils down to is Lady Catherine demands that Elizabeth promise her she is not in any current engagement with Darcy, and then she wants her to promise that she will not enter into an engagement with him in the future, claiming that she won't leave until she has these assurances. Lizzie is repulsed at the arrogance of the woman, thinking she can control people just because she wills it. She tells the mean old lady that, having taken enough insults from her already, she is going back inside the house. "Unfeeling, selfish girl! Do you not care that a connection with you would disgrace him in the eyes of everybody?" "I have nothing more to say," Lizzie said with a defiant glare in her eyes. Then Catherine said indignantly, "You are resolved to have him, then?" Lizzie couldn't believe this. "I have said no such thing," she cried. "I only resolved to live my life based on my own choices that I believe will bring me happiness without having to get permission from you or anybody else." As Lizzie walked back to the house, Lady Catherine warned her that she had tried to be reasonable, but that she should know she no longer holds the Bennet family in any high regard. Lizzie couldn't care less what the old bully thought of her. The last chapter before we get to the big fireworks is one that just builds up the mental turmoil in Lizzie's head. Was there really a rumor? And if so, did that mean Darcy might still feel something for her? And why did she so defiantly refuse to promise not to marry him? It sure seemed like she'd only do that if she truly hoped there was still a chance. But her ruminations were interrupted by her father saying that he had something to share with her. It's a letter from Mr. Collins. It starts with congratulations to the family for Jane's engagement, but very quickly turns to warning advice about the serious allegations that Lizzie has set her love on one of the most prestigious men in the country, and he warns against the evils of attempting such a union, despite the perceived upside. The letter is nothing special, other than, one, it shows how despite being a blood relative, Mr. Collins is obviously nothing but a loudly yapping lapdog of Lady Catherine, and will take her side on any issue, but two, this is the first signal to Papa B that something may be up, because he was surprised when Lizzie didn't find it as funny as he did. He had thought it was a wild accusation that was worthy of a laugh, because to the best of his knowledge, Lizzie still hated the man. And yet, she listened rather intently as he read the letter to her. Days after Lady Catherine's visit, Bingley had come to call on his fiancée, and Darcy was back with him again. Somehow, Lizzie found herself on a walk alone with him, the first time they'd really had alone since those brief moments at Pemberley. She launches in, apologizing first because she knows he'd wanted it kept a secret, but saying that she has to express her gratitude to him for everything he did for Lydia and, by extension, her whole family. He said something about how he hadn't realized Mrs. Gardiner was so little to be trusted, and Lizzie was quick to say that it was Lydia who originally let it slip, which probably wouldn't have surprised him much, but that once it was leaked, she had to get to the bottom of it. And again, she reiterated her deepest gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for all the trouble you have borne for the sake of my family." He looked at her with eyes that seemed hopeful but cautious. "If you will thank me, let it be for yourself alone. I can't attempt to deny it. Your family owe me nothing. I respect them, but I believe I only thought of you at the time." Elizabeth Bennet couldn't breathe. Darcy seemed eager to get to the root of the burning question on everyone's mind, and so he laid it all out. "I know you are too kind of a person to trifle with me. If you still feel the way you did last April, tell me now. My affections and wishes are unchanged." His voice trembled just a little. "But one word from you will silence me on the subject forever." And then, I don't know, guys. It feels like Jane Austen made a choice here. Maybe she just knew she couldn't write anything more emotional than what she had just had Darcy say. But we don't actually get the dialogue of Lizzie's response. I was blown away, but we just get a couple paragraphs that basically say she fumbled with her words to tell him that her feelings had changed a great deal, and then the happiness he felt upon hearing this was probably more happiness than ever felt by anyone before. Quote, "He expressed himself as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do." I'm not trying to rag on the author's skills here. She has written some of the best dialogue I've covered on the show so far. But like, what? It felt kind of like we tripped a little bit at the finish line. Luckily, we do still cross the finish line. They held hands and walked in silence for a while, not paying attention to where they were going. He opens up and admits that the reason he had come that day and entertained hope was because after her visit to Longbourn, Lady Catherine had confronted him and told him how obstinate of a girl Lizzie was, and said how she'd even had the nerve to refuse to promise that she wouldn't marry him. She had shared this in hopes of showing Darcy how unfit for highborn life this Miss Bennet was. Little could she have guessed it would have had the opposite effect on him. "It taught me to hope as I had scarcely ever allowed myself to hope before," he said. He reflects on that day of the first proposal and how she had described him so monstrously and how she considered him in so low regard. And he said despite knowing that her accusations were unaware of the truth, he had realized that the way he treated her, for example, saying that he was proposing to her against his better judgment, was somewhat horrible. Lizzie said she hoped that since then both of them had improved in their civility, but Darcy said he was having a harder time forgiving himself. That the things he had said had haunted him often over the course of those past months, especially the moment where she told him that, quote, "if he behaved more like a gentleman." That line from her had especially stung him. They spent more time reflecting on how ill-fated that day had been, but things turned to the letter. Her new fiance, yeah, that's another thing, since we don't get that dialogue from Lizzie's response, we don't actually get a real proposal or a yes. He just basically said, my feelings haven't changed. And she was like, well, mine have. And boom, they're engaged, I guess. But whatever. Her new fiance asked if the letter had changed how she saw him. She explained exactly the effect it had on her, how it gradually was able to undo all her prejudices towards him. He apologizes for the pain he was sure parts of it had given her, like where he said he didn't regret separating Bingley and Jane. At the time, he was too concerned with telling the truth to realize that what he was saying wasn't helpful. When I wrote the letter, he said, I believed myself perfectly calm and cool, but I am since convinced that it was written in a dreadful bitterness of spirit. Lizzie then asks the question that had been burning in her mind, what were you thinking when you saw me at your estate, unannounced? He basically says he was 100% surprised, and she said she was too, but she was more shocked at his behavior, by how kind and polite he was. But he told her that he had resolved to show her every civility in his power in hopes of changing her bad opinions of him. And he jokes that he can't remember exactly when he began to hope again, but that it probably started about 30 minutes after he saw her at Pemberley. After having wandered for hours, walking miles alone, they finally made their way back to Longbourn. And remember when I said Pride and Prejudice is a comedy? Yeah, I was lying. It's been a love story all along. But I made these claims of it being a war story and a comedy and now a love story because I wanted you to pay attention to how this story really contains multitudes. It is a disservice to think of it as just a period romance novel. There are plenty of other genres I could have labeled it as: cultural critique, family drama, etc., etc. Great stories can transcend one single label. And for the boy who always rolled his eyes when his mom or sisters popped in the VHS of the BBC miniseries of Pride and Prejudice because I knew that the TV was now claimed for the rest of the day, learning the actual story for myself has been an eye-opener. That night, Lizzie only opened up to one person, Jane. She'd kept the engagement secret until she told her older sister, and Jane took a long time to comprehend how this could be real. Lizzie jokes that if she can't convince Jane, it's going to be really hard for her to convince anyone else in the family. But you hate him, Jane said. And with a patient smile, Lizzie told her she had a lot to fill her in on. When Jane asked Lizzie how she first knew, Lizzie says it was when she first saw how large Pemberley was. Jane tells her to be serious, and then she shared the more important details about the letter. Jane is still coming to terms with everything, even after hearing the whole story. Are you quite certain that you can be happy with him? With a large grin, Lizzie replied that, quote, there can be no doubt of that. It is settled between us already that we are to be the happiest couple in the world. The next day, Darcy and Bingley came again. Darcy and Lizzie slipped out on a walk and made a game plan. Darcy would have to get her father's consent in private before they tell anybody else. She wasn't sure how her mother would take it, but that would be her responsibility when the time came. That evening, she saw Darcy and her father slip off into the study. A few minutes later, her fiancé came out and said that her father wanted to speak with her. Mr. Bennet was puzzled more than anything. Again, her whole family was under the impression that she didn't like him. He first thought she had lost her senses, and his only hesitation was not wanting her to consent to marrying a man if she didn't love him. Is that the only objection you have? She asked. Your belief that I don't like him? He tells her that, yeah, but that feels like a pretty big one to him. He told her the hardest thing for him to have to do would be to see his dear Lizzie married to someone she didn't respect. Lizzie then told him all about the last few months and topped it off with the details of how Darcy had been the one to save Lydia. This was enough to bring him fully on board, and he laughed when he remembered how he had thought the letter from Collins suggesting the engagement had been so absurd. When Lizzie broke the news to her mother, Mrs. Bennet said nothing for several minutes. It was like she was paralyzed. But when she finally recovered, she seemed to have forgotten everything bad that she'd ever said about Mr. Darcy. She praised him to Lizzie for being charming, handsome, tall, and rich. Lizzie would have a house in town. It was a relief to Lizzie that her mother could almost predictably be only concerned with seeing her daughters married to money. The only bad thing was this felt like a bad omen of how she could expect her mother to act around her new son-in-law to be. Over the rest of that night and the following day, she watched as her family members got to know her beloved Darcy better. She felt peace, but mostly absolute joy. We'll glide over to the chapter where they break the news to everyone outside the family. She writes the Gardners and thanks her cool aunt for demanding they tour Pemberley that day. Mr. B writes back to Mr. Collins, very briefly saying congratulations are in order for Lizzie after all, and that he may want to console Lady Catherine as best he can, but Mr. Bennet's advice is to stand by the nephew. He has more to give. Miss Bingley gave insincere congratulations to both parties, and there are interactions with the other relatives like the Phillipses. The Collins come to visit. This chapter is almost like a parade of, here's what you signed up for, Mr. Darcy, but he takes it with so much grace. You'd never guess he was the same man who refused to introduce himself to people that were beneath him. And now, in the final chapter, we get one of those where are they now kind of sequences. The narrator, stepping forward enough to address herself as I for the first time in the entire book, says, I wish I could say the joy that Mrs. Bennet felt for achieving her goal of marrying her daughters well was enough to make her sensible, amiable, and well-informed. But she still had her nervous fits that made her silly. Mr. Bennet missed Lizzie so much that he actually left Longbourn more than he had in years just to visit her. After a year in Meryton, the Bingleys needed more space from the mother-in-law, and they moved to the neighboring county where they were only 30 miles away from the Darcys. Kitty spent a lot of time visiting her older sisters. She was turning out to be much more sensible than Lydia. Mary still lived at home, but she also got out to visit her sisters and benefited from their large libraries and grand pianos. Wickham and Lydia, well, they didn't change much. Lizzie got a letter from Lydia congratulating her on her union and subtly hinting that if she could help Wickham get some job within Darcy's estate that would pay $300 to $400 a year, that would be lovely. Lizzie would never dare ask Darcy for such a favor, but that didn't stop her from sending Lydia a little money now and again to try to help. Georgiana lived at Pemberley with Fitzwilliam and Elizabeth, and she became best friends with her sister-in-law. Her brother continued to be supportive, loving, and protective of his sister. Lady Catherine was really mad for a long time. She wrote offensive letters to Darcy and threatened to never speak to him again. But at Lizzie's request, Darcy tried to make peace with her, and she caved pretty quickly. And, as always, here is the last paragraph directly from the book. Quote, with the Gardners, they were always on the most intimate terms. Darcy, as well as Elizabeth, really loved them, and they were both ever sensible of the warmest gratitude toward the persons who, by bringing her into Derbyshire, had been the means of uniting them. So, do you see why this book has received legendary status? I tried to do my best at illustrating just what makes it special for those that have avoided getting to know stories like this in the past, but I can promise you I didn't do it complete justice. Before we get to the lesson, if you enjoyed the episode and haven't given the show 5 stars, subscribed to be alerted for new episodes, or left a comment, how about you go do that right now? I would be most indebted to you. And you know what? Actually, that has been a problem since I started scripting this episode. My Slack messages at work have started sounding like a 19th century gentleman. It's really becoming a problem. But for our lesson today, I have a name for it. I call it the rare virtue of changing your mind. We live in a moment where changing your mind is treated with suspicion. If you change your mind on something, the world assumes you must have been naive, uninformed, or simply not sharp enough to get it right the first time. As if your intelligence is measured by how quickly you land on the correct opinion, rather than how willing you are to keep adjusting when new information appears. But Pride and Prejudice shows something far more true to human nature. You can feel absolutely certain you are right and still be operating on incomplete evidence to the point where you're actually wrong. And the people who grow, they're the ones who are willing to update their beliefs. Our era is deeply tribal, not just politically, though politics is a clear example, but philosophically, spiritually, socially. If you're a Republican who publicly entertains a Democratic idea, you're branded as disloyal. If you're a science-first person and you acknowledge anything that isn't measurable, someone calls you inconsistent. If you're religious but admit a secular perspective resonates, people will accuse you of watering down your faith. We've built a culture where your beliefs are treated like membership badges. If you change your mind, you risk being exiled. So we grip harder and we defend faster. And we refuse to consider that our first impression might not be the whole story. This is the opposite of what an honest thinker does. Here's a little philosophy 101 for you. The origins of philosophy was about truth-seeking, and that required openness. At its root, philosophy is a collaborative pursuit of truth. Two people sit down and agree to investigate reality together. But to engage in that kind of dialogue honestly, each person has to accept a simple condition that they may discover something today that changes what they believe. If you're not open to that, you're not debating, you're performing. And performers don't grow. This philosophical posture matters because the most important belief updates in your life rarely come from political arguments. They come from your everyday assumptions. And many of the most valuable things you can change your mind on aren't as big as your political party affiliation. Here are some examples that I thought of. What if you have a coworker that you just dislike? Maybe they're too outspoken, they're kind of intense. Maybe they just graded you the wrong way during your first week. But what if you allowed yourself to actually get to know them and reevaluate them? You might find that you have similar hobbies or similar ambitions or maybe the same sense of humor. You might even discover that the trait that annoyed you is a trait you respect when you see it in yourself. They could become one of your best friends. Or what if you have lived your life holding to the idea that work is just dull? This belief feels true because to this point in your life, it has always been dull. But often, it's just a result of having only tasted work that doesn't align with your strengths and your wishes. You might be one belief update away from discovering what kind of work genuinely can energize you. Or what about the labels, the self-limiting beliefs that we carry around inside of us all the time? I'm not athletic. I'm not creative. I don't have leadership qualities. These aren't facts. They're impressions left over from certain environments or stages of your life. Impressions that may not describe who you are now. Updating these ideas doesn't mean you're gullible. It means you're willing to be accurate. And this is something very important to be clear on. Changing your mind is not submission. It's agency. I'm not telling you that you should be easily swayed. I'm not saying that you should abandon your instincts or just trust anyone else's viewpoint, because your convictions still matter. Your boundaries still matter. But here's the deeper truth. You haven't yet encountered every idea that genuinely resonates with who you are becoming. How could you? There are people you haven't met, experiences you haven't lived, perspectives you haven't heard, any one which might fit you better than some belief you formed years ago. So being open to updating isn't passivity. It's choosing not to let outdated beliefs limit your future. It's not surrender. I'd call it sovereignty. And that mindset is exactly what unlocks the character arcs of Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy. Elizabeth Bennet prides herself on her judgment. She's witty, observant, perceptive, and her initial evidence about Mr. Darcy seems compelling. He snubs her, Wickham flatters her with a story that fits her bias, Darcy meddles in Bingley and Jane's relationship, so she forms a conclusion that feels airtight. But when Darcy's letter reveals the missing pieces, she doesn't retreat into stubbornness. She lets the truth reshape her understanding, and this is not weakness. This is more like self-respect. And Darcy's transformation is just as important. Elizabeth confronts him not with counter-evidence, but with a moral challenge, basically saying, you behaved in a way unworthy of the man that you think you are. His pride could have dismissed her. He could have rationalized every criticism, which is so common today. But instead, he reevaluates himself quietly and sincerely. He becomes more generous, more humble, more aligned with the person that he wants to be. Neither Lizzie or Darcy lose themselves by changing their minds. They refine themselves. Their happiness doesn't come from being able to say they've always been right. It comes from being willing to update what they believe until they arrive at what truly feels right. Changing your mind isn't inconsistency. It isn't betrayal. And it isn't a sign that you're easily manipulated. Changing your mind is what you do when you respect the truth enough to follow it, even if it means letting go of an old version of yourself. That is maturity. That's the heart of this story, and it's the hallmark of someone who's still growing, still listening, still capable of becoming the protagonist of their own life. And that does it for Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Before I sign off, my media recommendations. When it comes to Pride and Prejudice, there are 3 Hallmark adaptations. There's the 1940 film starring Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier, which is classic early Hollywood in the sense that they didn't know how to do anything that was truly period. If it was anything from the 1700s up until World War I, they just made it Victorian era in terms of wardrobe. It's a classic Hollywood film, but takes plenty of liberties. I will insert, I even watched Pride and Prejudice and Zombies out of curiosity, which was amusing at how it did manage to keep so much of the real story while injecting it with a completely mad dose of the apocalyptic. But the two big ones, the ones that can cause a debate among Austen diehards, there's the 1995 BBC miniseries with Colin Firth as Darcy, and there's the 2005 movie with Keira Knightley as Elizabeth. I watched both, which took 8 hours. I've seen the 2005 movie a dozen times, but the BBC series was often on in the Olsen household when I was a kid, but I was not about to sit down and watch that back then. The BBC one is almost a beat-for-beat adaptation. It has 6 hours to play with compared to the 2 hours of the 2005 film. So there are plenty of diehards who feel like it's sacrilegious to not say it's the best one by default. And if what you're looking for is essentially just the book in a visual format, then yeah, I'll give it to you. But if you are actually interested in a good viewing experience, it's 2005 by a mile. And that's not just because Keira Knightley was my celebrity crush when I was in high school. Yeah, I even had her picture in my locker. It's honestly an S-tier example of how to adapt a book for the screen. Obviously, a lot gets cut out, but they used the visual medium to capture things so well. A single look between two characters replaces the need for 2 pages of internal monologue. Not to mention, it's beautifully shot and the soundtrack is goated. But maybe my absolute favorite part is Tom Hollander as Mr. Collins is one of the best things you'll ever see. I actually remember going on a date with a gal when I was in college, and somehow this came up. Because, like I said when I plugged this episode at the end of the King Arthur episode, women appreciate a man who is able to talk about Jane Austen intelligently, even if all I could talk about was the 2005 movie at the time. But I remember she was so huffy, sticking her nose in the air about how she hated the 2005 one because of things like the line during the second proposal where Darcy stumbles over saying, "I love you," because that's not in the book. Well, now that I've read the book, Lauren, I am calling you out. Of course it's not in the book. There's no dialogue for that scene in the book. All it says is he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. Sorry, I get heated when people are prejudiced against great art for stupidly nitpicky reasons. But in short, fellas, if you have never opened yourself up to watching Pride and Prejudice with your significant other, I'll be straight up and say, I think you may be pleasantly surprised how much you can appreciate the 2005 film. I give no such assurances about how you'll feel sitting through 6 hours of the 1995 miniseries. That feels like it was made by someone with no imagination. But okay, I've done enough damage today. If you love Jane Austen, how'd I do? Would Jane be okay with this interpretation? And for those of you who never risked Pride and Prejudice before I made this, how are you feeling right now? Are you seeing the value in stories like this that you may not have seen before? Protagonists, of course, I've got more for you. We're going to analyze a couple things about characters that I didn't have time to fit in this episode today. If you want extended versions of all the episodes, on top of show notes and things at the end, on this episode, I actually gave several extended takes to some of my favorite scenes. There's a link in the description below if you want to sign up for that. But for now, thank you guys for joining me on this roller coaster of a story. I hope you start to see the beauty in being open to changing your mind when you get enough evidence that it's the right thing to do. I'm Jameson Olsen. You've been listening to Becoming the Main Character. Thank you so much for tuning in.